Opening. Good evening. Welcome back. Tonight we have a particularly long journey ahead of us. 5 hours. In fact, so there is truly no need to stay awake for all of it. Just let the words carry you. Wherever you drift off, the story will keep going, steadily, gently, like a river that doesn't mind whether anyone is watching it flow. And if you wake in the middle and find yourself somewhere unexpected in the tale, well, that is rather the charm of a journey this long. You can always come back and find where you left off. Or you can close your eyes once more and let the current take you somewhere new. It is, by any measure, a vast story. Not merely long though, 5 hours is admittedly ambitious, but vast in the world it covers. Because tonight, we are stepping into the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire, at its height, stretched across 3 continents, governed dozens of languages, and endured for over 600 years. It is one of the longest-lived empires in human history, and the lives of the people who built it, sustained it, and passed their days within its borders was so different from our own that most of us would find it, truthfully, a rather different world from the one we know. The heat of the hammam, the silence demanded inside the palace walls, the months-long caravan journeys across Anatolia, with nothing but a donkey and a prayer. It was a world that required a kind of patience and resilience that we have, for better or worse, largely forgotten. But we are not going there to endure it. We are going there to wander through it gently, curiously, and at our own pace. If you enjoy what you hear tonight, a like or a subscribe is always appreciated, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your city and the local time in the comments. There is something rather lovely about knowing that someone in Sao Paulo, and someone in Seoul, and someone in Edinburgh might all be drifting off to the same story about 16th century Istanbul at the very same moment. Now, dim the lights. Let your breathing slow. Settle into wherever you are. Your bed, your sofa, your favourite chair. Pull the blanket a little closer if you need to. Notice the familiar scent of your pillow, the cool softness of the sheets against your skin, and imagine yourself stepping back in time. Tonight we will wander through the Ottoman world, slowly and in no particular hurry. We will begin in Istanbul, in the golden age of Suleiman, the magnificent, and walk the city's winding streets from the first call, to prayer at dawn, to the last lamp extinguished at night. We will step inside palaces and mosques, run our fingers across the blue arabesques of Iznik tiles, and leaf through manuscripts that have lain unopened for centuries. And then we will travel further into the unhurried villages of Anatolia, through the great upheavals of reform, past hidden communities and lost musical traditions, and finally into the modern world, where the empire's echoes linger still in the warm, honeyed taste of baklava on your tongue, and in the stone fountains, still trickling in forgotten village squares from the Balkans to Jerusalem. 600 years, 3 continents, and all the time in the world. So let us begin softly, as all long journeys should begin, as the ezan sounds over the rooftops of Istanbul, and the first pale light of dawn touches the waters of the Golden Horn. Segment 1. Daily Life Immersion. A day in 16th century Istanbul. Let us begin where so many days in this city began, in darkness, in stillness, in the hush before the world remembered itself. It is sometime in the 1560s. The exact year does not matter very much. What matters is the place Istanbul, the seat of the Ottoman Empire, the city that straddles 2 continents, the city that the Ottomans called simply the threshold of felicity. And you are here. Not as a visitor, not as a scholar peering through the glass of centuries, but as a resident, an ordinary soul living, an ordinary life in one of the largest and most storied cities in the known world. You are lying on a thin sleeping mat, stuffed with cotton and wool, spread over a low wooden platform in the corner of a room. The room is small. By modern standards, it would feel almost bare. There is no wardrobe, no chest of drawers, no clutter of possessions lining the walls. Instead, the walls themselves serve as furniture. Shallow niches carved into the plaster hold your folded bedding during the day, your oil lamp, a wooden comb, perhaps a few copper coins wrapped in cloth. The floor beneath you is covered in a woven kilim, its geometric pattern reds and deep blues, barely visible in the darkness. The ceiling is low, the timber beams overhead, darkened by years of smoke from the brazier that sits cold and ashy in the centre of the room, awaiting the colder months. The air is cool, not cold. This is not a northern city, but cool in the way that stone and timber houses hold the night long after the sun has set. You can smell the faintest trace of damp plaster, the lingering ghost of last evening's cooking perhaps, onion and lamb fat, and, beneath it all, the clean mineral scent of limestone and old wood. If you were to reach out and press your hand against the wall beside you, you would feel roughness, a chalky, uneven texture beneath your fingertips. Whitewashed many times over, but never quite smooth. This is your home. A modest timber house in the Fatih district, on the European side of the city, not far from the great mosque complex that Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror, built a century ago. Your house is one of many in a tight cluster along a winding lane. It shares its courtyard with two other families, and in that courtyard there is a well, a fig tree that gives good shade in summer, and a stone bench where, on warm evenings, the old man from the house next door likes to sit and smoke his pipe and say very little. You do not own this house. Very few people in Ottoman Istanbul own the land beneath their feet. Most urban land is held as vakif, a charitable endowment administered by a religious foundation. You pay a modest rent, and in return, you are part of a neighbourhood, a mahalle, that functions almost like a village within the city. Everyone knows everyone. The imam of the local mosque knows your name, your father's name, your trade. If you were to disappear one morning, someone would notice before noon. And now, in the darkness, the first sound of the day reaches you. It begins as a single voice, distant, clear, rising from the minaret of the nearest mosque. The azan, the call to prayer, carrying across the rooftops in long, melismatic phrases that seem to stretch time itself. The words are Arabic, and even if you do not understand every syllable, the melody is as familiar to you as your own breathing. It is the sound that has marked the boundary between night and day, for as long as you can remember. Within moments, other voices join it from minarets further away, some fainter, some deeper in tone, until the air above. The city is layered with overlapping calls, each slightly out of time with the others, creating a wash of sound that is neither music nor speech, but something in between. It reverberates off the limestone walls. It seeps through your shuttered windows. It is, in the truest sense of the word, an awakening. You rise. You fold your bedding carefully, methodically, because tidiness is not merely a preference in an Ottoman household. It is a point of quiet pride, and you tuck it into the wall niche. You slip your feet into a pair of leather slippers and make your way downstairs past the main room, where the family gathers during the day. A room with low cushions arranged around the edges, a wooden chest for valuables, and a Quran wrapped in green cloth on a high shelf and out into the courtyard. The courtyard is still dim. The sky above is that deep, ambiguous blue that comes just before dawn, not quite night, not quite morning. The fig tree is a silhouette. The stone beneath your feet is cold and slightly damp with dew. You cross to the small fountain near the courtyard wall, a cheshma, fed by the city's remarkable network of underground cisterns and aqueducts, and you begin your ablutions. The water is cold. It shocks the skin. You wash your hands 3 times, rinse your mouth, splash your face, wet, your forearms to the elbows, pass damp hands over your hair and the back of your neck. And finally, wash your feet. The ritual is precise, unhurried, and performed in the same order every single day. It is called wudu, and it is the physical and spiritual preparation for prayer. If you are devout, and most residents of 16th century Istanbul would describe themselves as such, though the depth of devotion varied as much then. As it does now, you make your way to the neighbourhood mosque for the Fajr prayer. The mosque is a humble, single-dome structure with a slender minaret, a carpeted interior that smells of rosewater and wool, and room enough for perhaps 40 men. You line up shoulder to shoulder with your neighbours, the baker, the leather worker, the retired soldier who walks with a limp, and you pray. The imam's voice is soft and steady. The ritual takes perhaps 10 minutes, and then it is done, and the day has officially begun. Close your eyes for a moment and feel that rhythm of the water, the prayer, the silence afterwards. It is a rhythm that carried an entire city from night into day. Every morning, the same. The call, the water, the prayer, the return. A rhythm so deeply embedded in daily life that it required no thought, no decision, no effort of will. It was. And now, let us step out into the streets. The lane outside your courtyard gate is tight, so close set that if two donkeys were to pass one another, both riders would need to tuck in their knees. The houses lean slightly inward overhead, their upper stories jutting out over the street on wooden supports, creating a kind of tunnel effect. In summer, this provides welcome shade. In winter, it channels the wind. Right now, in the early morning light, the effect is one of intimacy. You are enclosed, sheltered, walking through a corridor of timber and stone that feels as private as the interior of your own home. But the sounds tell you that the city is waking. Somewhere ahead, a rooster crows, and yes, roosters were kept even in the heart of the city, along with chickens, the occasional goat, and cats in truly extraordinary numbers. The Ottomans were remarkably fond of cats. Charitable endowments existed specifically to feed stray cats. Travellers from Europe frequently remarked upon it. You turn a corner and the lane opens slightly. Here, at the junction of two streets, you find the first commercial activity of the day, a baker's shop, its wood-fired oven, already radiating a wall of dry heat into the morning air. The baker, a member of the Ekmekçi Guild, has been at work since long before the Ezan. His apprentices are pulling rounds of flatbread from the oven with long wooden paddles, while on a rotating spit beside the door, rings of simit are turning a deep, burnished gold. Their surface is encrusted with toasted sesame seeds. The smell reaches you before anything else does. Warm, yeasty, faintly nutty from the sesame, with a base note of wood smoke that clings to everything within 10 paces of the oven. You buy a simit. The price is fixed by the authorities, so there is no need to haggle, and you eat it as you walk, tearing off pieces with your fingers, the crust cracking satisfyingly between your teeth, while the inside is soft and still warm. A few paces further on, a street vendor stands behind a low wooden cart, ladling boza, a thick, slightly fermented drink made from millet into small earthenware cups. Boza is a winter favourite, but in truth it is consumed year-round, particularly in the mornings. It is pale, creamy, sweet, with a faintly sour tang that catches the back of your throat. The texture is almost porridge-like, and the fermentation gives it a mildly yeasty quality. But it is filling, it is cheap, and on a cool Istanbul morning, it warms you from the inside out. The vendor knows your face. He nods. You nod back. No words are exchanged. And so another morning begins, in the same unhurried way as all the others. As you walk further into the waking city, you begin to notice the subtle machinery of order that governs Ottoman urban life. This is a city of well over 500,000 people, the largest in Europe and possibly the largest in the world at this time. And yet it functions with a degree of regularity that often astonished foreign visitors. The streets, though narrow, are not chaotic. Refuse is collected, water flows, bread is sold at fixed prices, and the reasons for this order are embedded in a system of oversight that touches nearly every aspect of daily life. At the centre of that system is the Qadi, the Islamic judge, appointed by the Sultan to oversee a particular district. The Qadi's responsibilities are vast, adjudicating disputes between neighbours, enforcing commercial regulations, recording marriages and property transactions, and serving, in effect, as both judge and civic administrator. His courtroom, the Mahkeme, is often located near the central mosque of the district, and it is open to all. A merchant who believes he has been cheated, a wife seeking to enforce the financial terms of her marriage contract, a craftsman disputing the quality of materials, all may bring their case before the Qadi, and his ruling, recorded meticulously in a court register called a Sisil, carries the weight of both religious and imperial authority. But the Qadi does not patrol the streets himself. That task falls to the Muhtasib, the market inspector, a figure who is, in some ways, the most visible arm of Ottoman urban governance. The Muhtasib walks through the bazaars and commercial districts, checking weights and measures, tasting bread to ensure it meets quality standards, inspecting the freshness of meat and fish, and issuing fines to those who violate the established codes. If a baker used inferior flour, or a butcher exceeded the nar, the officially fixed price, the Muhtasib would intervene. Most, often with a warning or a modest fine. And there is the imam of the neighbourhood mosque, the same figure who called the azan at dawn, who serves not only as a spiritual leader, but as a quiet registrar of the community, keeping careful note of who arrives, who departs, and any disturbances that might unsettle the peace of the Mahalli. We take for granted today the invisible systems that keep our cities functioning, the water treatment plants, the building inspectors, the food safety regulators working behind the scenes. In 16th century Istanbul, those systems were not invisible at all. They were embodied in specific people, walking specific streets, performing specific tasks. And they worked. Imagine yourself there, just for a moment, walking these winding lanes, simit in hand, nodding to the vendor, stepping aside to let a donkey pass, and knowing that somewhere nearby, the Qadi is already hearing his first case of the morning, the Muhtasib is weighing a sack of flour, and the Imam is recording a name in the register. The city hums, the city functions, and you are a part of it, one thread in a very large, very old, and very intricate tapestry. By mid-morning, you have reached the heart of Ottoman commerce, the Kapalı Çarşı, the Grand Bazaar. To call it a market is rather like calling the ocean a puddle. The Grand Bazaar of 16th century Istanbul is not a single building, but a vast labyrinthine complex of covered streets, vaulted arcades, courtyards, and caravanserais that sprawls across an area roughly the size of a small town. By this period, it likely contains somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 individual shops, organised with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. You enter through one of the main gates, heavy wooden doors set into a stone archway, and immediately the world changes. The light dims. The open sky is replaced by vaulted stone ceilings, pierced at intervals by small openings that let in shafts of dusty sunlight. The air shifts. It is warmer in here, more enclosed, and the smells, layered, complex, inescapable, reach you before anything else. First, leather. The tanners and leather workers occupy a section near the entrance, and the sharp, acrid scent of tanned hides mingles with the richer, oilier smell of finished saddles and belts. Then, as you walk deeper, spices, cinnamon, black pepper, cloves, saffron, cardamom, arriving in burlap sacks from the Indian Ocean trade, via Egypt and the Red Sea. Then textiles, the dry, clean smell of raw cotton and linen, the faintly sweet scent of silk, the musty undertone of stacked wool carpets. The spatial logic of the bazaar is deliberate. Each trade occupies its own designated street or section. The jewellers cluster in one arcade, the silk merchants in another, the booksellers in yet another. This is not an accident of history, it is policy. The Ottoman guild system, the esnaf and lonza, regulates not only what may be sold, but where, by whom, and at what price. Each guild has its own hierarchy: the usta, the master craftsman, the kalfa, the journeyman, and the surak, the apprentice. Becoming a master requires years of training, a test of skill, and the approval of the guild elders. The system is designed to maintain quality, prevent unfair competition, and ensure that the ordinary person walking through the bazaar with a few akçe in their purse can trust what they are buying. Picture this. You pause at a silk merchant's stall. The fabric is draped over a wooden frame, and even in the dim light of the arcade, it shimmers deep crimson, imperial purple, a green so dark it is almost black. This silk has travelled an extraordinary distance to reach this stall. Some of it was woven in Bursa, the Ottoman silk capital, from raw threads imported along the ancient Silk Road. Some arrived from Persia, carried by caravans across the highlands of eastern Anatolia. The merchant lifts a corner of the fabric and lets it fall through his fingers, slowly, deliberately, so that you can see the weight, the drape, the way the light catches the weave. He names a price. You count. He sighs theatrically. You shrug equally theatrically. This is not merely commerce. It is a social ritual, a performance that both parties understand and, in their own way, enjoy. The final price will be somewhere in the middle, and both of you will walk away satisfied. Elsewhere in the bazaar, the sounds layer upon one another. The rhythmic tap, tap, tap of a coppersmith's hammer shaping a tray. The low murmur of negotiation from the carpet seller's arcade. The clink of coins being counted. A boy carrying a tray of tiny tulip-shaped glasses filled with tea weaves through the crowd with practiced ease, delivering refreshment to merchants who never seem to leave their stalls. The tea is dark, strong, brewed almost to the point of bitterness, and served with a small cube of sugar on the side. You take the glass between your thumb and forefinger, almost too hot to hold, and you sip. The warmth spreads through your chest. The Grand Bazaar is not merely a place of buying and selling. It is a place of information. News travels here faster than anywhere else in the city. A merchant who trades with Venetians knows what is happening in the Mediterranean. A spice dealer with contacts in Cairo has heard rumours from the Red Sea. A bookseller can tell you about a new manuscript arrived from Persia. In an age without newspapers, the bazaar serves as Istanbul's newsroom, its stock exchange, and its social club, all compressed into a labyrinth of stone and commerce. The hours passed. The light shifted through the small openings in the vaulted ceiling, moving slowly across the stone floor like the hands of a sundial. Let that image settle for a moment. The slow migration of light across old stone. The bazaar carried on as it did every day, as it had for generations, as it would for generations still to come. But even the bazaar empties eventually. The afternoon call to prayer, the Asr, signals the beginning of the day's long, slow descent toward evening. The merchants begin to cover their wares. Apprentices sweep the stone floors. The heavy gates will be locked at nightfall by the bazaar's own guards. Bekçi who will patrol the arcades through the night, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. And you, having completed whatever business brought you here, make your way back through the streets toward a different kind of institution, one that is, in its own way, just as central to Ottoman social life as the bazaar itself. The kahvehane, the coffee house. Coffee arrived in Istanbul sometime in the mid-16th century, probably carried by traders from Yemen by way of Egypt, and it spread through the city with a swiftness that surprised even the authorities. Within a few decades, coffee houses had sprung up in every neighbourhood, and they had become something genuinely new in Ottoman urban life. A public space that was neither mosque nor market, where men of different trades and classes could sit together, drink, talk, and listen. The coffee house you enter is a low-ceilinged room, cushioned benches along the walls, a few small tables, and at the centre, a large copper vessel in which the coffee is brewed. The coffee is prepared slowly in a chesva, a small, long-handled pot set over a charcoal brazier, the grounds so fine they are almost powder. The liquid rising in a thick, dark foam before being poured into a finjan no larger than an egg. It arrives on a saucer, sometimes with a piece of Turkish delight, or a sliver of dried fruit. The taste is intense, bitter, earthy, thick on the tongue, with a sediment that settles at the bottom of the cup like fine silt. You do not gulp it. You sip slowly, meditatively, and you listen, because the coffee house is, above all, a place of listening. In the corner, a storyteller, a medda, is holding court. He sits on a slightly raised platform, the staff in one hand and a handkerchief in the other, and he tells stories. Long, winding stories, tales of Nasruddin Hoxha's wit, of ancient heroes and improbable journeys, of love and loss, and the quiet turns of fortune, all told, in a voice that rises and falls with practiced cadence, now whispering, now deepening, now pausing for effect while the audience leans in. Let yourself drift into that room for a moment. The low murmur falls away as the story takes hold. Cups are forgotten mid-sip, pipes are left unsmoked. For a little while, the world outside the bazaar, the regulations, the endless demands of commerce ceases to exist, and there is only the voice, and the story, and the dark, fragrant coffee, cooling in your hand. And so the evening drifted on, unhurried, familiar, one much like the last. When the storyteller pauses because the best stories are never truly finished. They are merely suspended until the next night you rise, leave a coin or two on the table, and make your way to the final destination of your day, the hammam. The neighbourhood hammam is a domed stone building, its exterior unremarkable, but inside it is a world of steam and warmth and ritual. You leave your clothes and belongings in a wooden locker in the outer room, the kamikan, and wrap yourself in a thin cotton cloth called a peshtamal. You slip wooden clogs onto your feet. The marble floors are wet and treacherously slippery, and you pass through the warm room, the iliklik, where your body adjusts to the rising temperature, and finally into the hot room, the sıcaklık, where the air is thick with steam that curls around you like a living thing. Close your eyes and imagine the warmth. The sensation is enveloping. The marble beneath your feet is hot. Not painfully so, but insistently, radiantly warm, heated from below by a wood-fired furnace called a kulhan. You lie down on the central marble platform, the göbek taşı, the navel stone, and the heat seeps into your muscles, your joints, your bones. The steam carries the scent of olive oil, soap and something faintly herbal laurel, perhaps. A telak, the bath attendant, kneels beside you and begins the scrub a thorough exfoliation using a coarse mitt called a keys that removes dead skin in long, pale rolls. It is not a gentle process. But afterwards, when the telak pours warm water over you from a copper bowl, and the soap, lather whipped to a thick, fragrant foam, is spread across your shoulders and back, the feeling of cleanliness is almost transcendent. The hammam was not merely about hygiene, though hygiene was central. It was a social institution, a place of conversation and gossip, and unhurried camaraderie. In the men's sections, business deals were discussed, friendships maintained, neighbourhood news exchanged. In the women's sections, which operated on separate days or in separate buildings, the hammam was one of the few public spaces where women could gather freely, away from the domestic sphere. Mothers brought their daughters to be seen by other mothers. Women sang, shared food, exchanged remedies and recipes, and, occasionally, discreetly evaluated prospective brides or grooms. The hammam was, in every sense, a community institution, as vital to the social fabric of the neighbourhood as the mosque or the market. You leave the hammam in the early evening, your skin tingling, your body loose and warm. The streets are quieter now. The lanterns have been lit, small oil lamps in glass cases, hung at intervals along the main thoroughfares by the neighbourhood watch. The light they cast is faint, flickering, barely enough to see by. The city has no street lighting in the modern sense. Beyond the reach of these lamps, the lanes are dark, and most people hurry home before full darkness falls. You return to your courtyard house. The evening meal is simple, a stew of lamb and chickpeas cooked slowly in a clay pot. The broth thick and fragrant with cumin and dried mint. A plate of pilaf, each grain separate and glistening flatbread for scooping a dish of yogurt. Cool and sharp, and, if the season is right, a few figs or a handful of grapes, their skins still warm from the afternoon sun. The family eats together, seated on the floor around a low table. The conversation is soft. The children are sleepy. The oil lamp casts a gentle amber glow across the room, and the shadows are long and still. After the meal, you perform the Isha, the final prayer of the day. You unroll your prayer mat in the corner of the room, face the Qibla, the direction of Mecca, and kneel. The words are familiar. The movements are familiar. The stillness that follows is familiar too. The lamp is extinguished. The house is dark. And if you are still listening now, let your own breathing slow to match the stillness of this room. The courtyard is silent except for the faint rustle of the fig tree in the night breeze, and somewhere in the distance, the slow, measured footsteps of the bekçi, the night watchman, making his rounds, tapping his staff on the cobblestones to let the neighbourhood know that someone is awake. Someone is watching, and all is well. And that was a day. An ordinary day in a city, unlike any other, in a century that is now half a millennium behind us. The simit you ate this morning has been eaten by millions since. The ezan still sounds over Istanbul at dawn. The Grand Bazaar still stands. Still hums with trade, still carries the scent of leather and spice and tea. But the timber houses of the Fatih district are mostly gone, replaced by concrete. The bekçi no longer taps his staff in the night. The storyteller's platform in the coffee house sits empty, and the stories he told are remembered only in fragments, in books, in the quiet corners of a culture that has moved on, but has not entirely forgotten. This was their world, and for a little while tonight, it was yours too. Segment 2. Biography. Event narrative. The entire reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. Now let us turn from the ordinary rhythms of daily life to a single, quietly consequential life that unfolded far above those streets. A life whose decisions shaped not only this city, but in time, the course of 3 continents. We are going to spend some time, you and I, with the man the West called Suleiman, the Magnificent, and whom his own people knew by a rather different, and arguably more telling, title Kanuni, the lawgiver. But before the laws, before the poetry and the gold and the grief that would mark his later years, there was a boy, and that boy grew up far from Istanbul, in the provincial corners of an empire that was still, in the late 15th century, finding its shape. Suleiman was born in 1494, or possibly 1495. The sources do not quite agree, in the Black Sea port city of Trabzon, where his father, the future Sultan Selim I, served as provincial governor. Trabzon was a handsome but modest place by Ottoman standards, a city of steep green hills tumbling down to the sea, of old Byzantine churches that had been converted into mosques, of fishing boats rocking gently in the harbour, and the sharp, briny smell of salt, air mixing with pine resin from the forests above the town. It was not Istanbul. It was not the centre of anything, and in a sense, that was precisely the point. Ottoman princes were not raised in the capital. They were sent out deliberately, methodically, to serve as Sancak Beyi, governors of provincial districts, where they were expected to learn the practical arts of ruling, collecting taxes, settling disputes, commanding soldiers, administering justice to populations that were often diverse in language, religion, and custom. It was an apprenticeship, and it was not optional. A prince who could not govern a province would not be trusted to govern an empire. Suleiman's early postings took him first to Kaffa on the Crimean coast, a busy port city whose harbour still bore the mark of its Genoese merchant past, and then, more significantly, to Manisa in western Anatolia, a prosperous agricultural region known for its vineyards, its warm thermal springs, and its proximity to the Aegean trade routes. In Manisa, the young prince would have lived in the governor's residence, a modest palace by imperial standards, surrounded by a small court of tutors, advisors, and servants. His mornings might have begun with a cup of sherbet sweetened with honey from the local hillsides, or a simple breakfast of warm bread and white cheese, taken in a courtyard where the early sun warmed the flagstones underfoot. His days were structured around a rigorous education, Islamic jurisprudence and Quranic studies under the guidance of appointed scholars. The Persian literary classics that formed the backbone of Ottoman high culture, calligraphy, horsemanship, and unusually, goldsmithing. The goldsmithing is a detail worth pausing over. It was common for Ottoman princes to learn a trade, a practical skill that would, in theory, allow them to earn a living if fortune turned against them. But Suleiman's choice of goldsmithing was more than a passing formality. The chroniclers describe a young man with careful hands and a patient temperament, someone who found genuine satisfaction in the precise, delicate work of shaping metal. The gentle tap of a small hammer on a gold leaf, the careful setting of a gemstone into a bezel, the slow, meditative process of engraving a pattern into a surface no larger than a thumbnail. Imagine the scene: a workshop in the governor's residence in Manisa, the afternoon light slanting through a latticed window, the faint smell of charcoal from the small forge, and the young prince bent over his workbench, utterly absorbed in the task of turning raw metal into something beautiful. It tells us something about the man he would become. Suleiman was not by temperament a warrior. He was not his father, Selim the Grim, who had claimed the throne through force of arms and spent his brief, restless reign, extending the empire's borders into Egypt and the Levant. Suleiman was more deliberate, more inclined to build than to break. The chroniclers describe him as tall, slender, pale-skinned, with a long face and a serious expression that rarely softened into a smile. He spoke carefully, he listened more than he talked, and he wrote poetry, a habit he would maintain throughout his life, composing verse under the pen name Muhibbi, which translates loosely as the lover. And so the years of his apprenticeship passed, steadily, in the provincial calm of Manisa, until, in September of 1520, word arrived that his father was dead. Selim I had succumbed to illness on the road back from a campaign. The throne was empty, and Suleiman, at the age of 25 or 26, rode to Istanbul to claim it. The accession of a new sultan was an event of enormous ceremonial weight. Upon arriving in the capital, Suleiman was met by the great officers of state, the Grand Vizier, the Chief Mufti, the commanders of the Janissary Corps, and escorted to the Topkapı Palace, where he received the bayah, the oath of allegiance, from the assembled dignitaries. Coins were struck bearing his name and title. Gifts were distributed to the Janissaries, to the court, officials, to the poor of the city. Prayers were offered in every mosque. The empire, which stretched from the Danube to the Nile, from the Adriatic to the Persian frontier, had a new master. The question that lingered in every courtier's mind, though none would have spoken it aloud, was a quiet one. What manner of ruler would this young man prove to be? The answer came swiftly, and it came not on the battlefield, though campaigns would follow soon enough, but in the law courts. Suleiman's most lasting legacy, the one that earned him the title, Kanuni, was his comprehensive reform and codification of Ottoman law. This was not a simple task. The Ottoman legal system operated on two parallel tracks: the Sharia, the body of Islamic religious law, derived from the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet, and the Qanun, the body of sultanic law, secular decrees and regulations, issued by the Sultan himself to address matters that the Sharia did not explicitly cover, such as taxation, land tenure, criminal penalties, and the regulation of trade. Previous sultans had issued Qanun, but their decrees were often piecemeal, inconsistent, and poorly archived. Picture, if you will, a long shelf of leather-bound registers in a palace archive, each one slightly different in format, the ink fading to brown at the edges, the pages carrying the faint, dry smell of old paper and lamp oil. That was the state of Ottoman law when Suleiman inherited it. He undertook something far more ambitious, a systematic harmonization of the entire legal framework, ensuring that Qanun and Sharia did not contradict one another, that laws were applied consistently across the empire's vast and diverse territories, and that the rights and obligations of every class of subject, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, were clearly defined. The result was a body of law that touched nearly every aspect of life. Tax codes were standardised. Arbitrary levies that provincial governors had sometimes imposed were curtailed. Land tenure was clarified. State-owned fields distinguished from vakif endowments and freehold property. And the rights of the peasant farmers who actually worked, that land were, for the first time, set down in writing. Criminal statutes were revised, with penalties calibrated, at least in principle, to the severity of the offence. And the millet system, under which the empire's Christian and Jewish communities governed their own internal affairs, according to their own religious laws, was given clearer legal definition and protection. Settle a little deeper into the quiet of your evening and consider, for a moment, the sheer administrative complexity of this undertaking. The Ottoman Empire in the 16th century encompassed Arabs, Turks, Greeks, Serbs, Hungarians, Bulgarians, Albanians, Kurds, Armenians, Jews, and dozens of other communities. It included Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and adherents of faiths and traditions that defied easy categorization. To create a legal framework that could accommodate all of these populations, that could be administered by cadis in Cairo and Belgrade and Baghdad, with some degree of consistency, was an achievement of considerable intellectual and bureaucratic sophistication. It was not perfect, no legal system is, but it endured in its essentials for centuries, long after Suleiman himself was gone. And so the empire settled, slowly, into its new legal order. The administrative machinery that enforced these laws was centred on the Divan-i-Humayun, the imperial council which met several times a week in a hall within the Topkapı palace. The Divan was chaired not by the Sultan himself, but by the Grand Vizier, the highest-ranking official in the empire, and it included the other viziers, the chief military judges, the heads of the treasury, and various senior administrators. The Sultan, if he wished to observe, could do so from behind a latticed window, unseen but present. Petitions from subjects across the empire were heard, disputes adjudicated, policy debated, and decisions recorded by a cadre of scribes, whose reed pens scratched softly against heavy paper in the cool, lamplit chamber their handwriting, so precise and so uniform that modern scholars sometimes struggle to distinguish one scribe's hand from another's. If you listened carefully, you might have heard nothing more than that faint scratching, the occasional murmur of a clerk turning a page, and the distant call of a gull beyond the palace walls. It was a world away from our own, a world without legislatures, without constitutions in the modern sense, without the separation of powers that we take for granted today. And yet, within its own framework, it functioned. Justice was not always done. Power was not always wielded wisely. But the aspiration was there, written into the law codes in Suleiman's own name, that the Sultan's authority was not the authority of the sword alone, but also the authority of the pen, and that a just ruler was one who governed not by whim but by law. And so the seasons turned, and the scribes filled their registers, and the cadis carried their rulings from courthouse to courthouse across the provinces, and the careful, unglamorous work of getting the laws right continued year after year, like a river that moves too slowly to notice, but never quite stops. But there is, of course, another side to this story. Behind the law codes and the council meetings, behind the public face of the Kanuni, there was a private man. And the private life of Suleiman was shaped, for more than 3 decades, by one singular relationship, a bond that would have been unlikely in any court, and that was unprecedented in this one. Her name, before she entered the Ottoman court, is lost to us. The sources suggest she was born around 1505, probably in the Ruthenian lands of what is now western Ukraine, and that she was captured in a raid and brought to Istanbul, where she was placed within the imperial harem. She was given the name Hürrem the Cheerful One, and in the West, she would come to be known as Roxolana. She was not, by the standards of Ottoman court protocol, supposed to become what she became. She was supposed to be one concubine among many, a bearer, perhaps, of a single son, and then a comfortable retirement to a provincial estate. That was how the system worked. That was how it had always worked. Hürrem quietly, thoroughly transformed it. Within a few years of her arrival, she had become the exclusive companion of the Sultan, an arrangement so unprecedented that it scandalized the court. Suleiman did not merely favor her, he married her, making her his legal wife, a step that no sultan had taken with a former slave in living memory. He wrote her love poems, tender, aching verses, in which the mighty Kanuni became simply Muhibbi, the lover, confessing his longing, and his devotion in the elaborate metaphorical language of Ottoman court poetry. My springtime, my merry-faced love, my daytime, my sweetheart, laughing leaf, my woman of the beautiful hair, my love of the slanted brow, my love of eyes full of mischief. These are not the words of a distant sovereign. They are the words of a man in love, deeply, helplessly, and very publicly. The letters they exchanged when Suleiman was away on campaign are among the most notable documents of Ottoman private life. Hürrem's letters, written in a flowing, slightly ungrammatical Turkish that suggests she composed them herself, rather than dictating to a scribe, are vivid, affectionate, and disarmingly direct. She tells him of children's health, of the weather in Istanbul, of her longing for his return. She calls him my Sultan and my everything. She worries about him, and her influence extended far beyond the domestic. Hürrem was, by any measure, one of the most powerful women in the 16th century world. She corresponded directly with foreign monarchs, with Sigismund II of Poland, with Shah Tahmasp of Persia, in her own name and on her own authority. She commissioned one of the largest charitable complexes in Istanbul, the Haseki Sultan Kulliye, which included a mosque, a madrasa, a hospital, a public kitchen, and a primary school funded by her own personal endowment. The public kitchen alone is said to have fed at least 500 people daily. She was a builder, a diplomat, and a political strategist who navigated the intrigues of the Ottoman court with a skill that earned her both admiration and, from those who resented her influence, deep hostility. Close your eyes, if they are not closed, already, and picture the inner court of Topkapı Palace as it might have been on a still afternoon. The gardens are immaculate rose bushes, tulips in spring, tall, cypress trees casting long shadows across gravelled paths. Somewhere, a fountain murmurs. The air smells of rose water and cut grass and the faintest trace of ink. In a pavilion overlooking the water, Suleiman sits on a low cushion, a sheet of hand-pressed paper before him, a reed pen in his fingers. The paper is smooth beneath his wrist, thick, faintly cream-coloured, cool to the touch. The pen makes a soft scratching sound as it moves across the page, the sound of a man composing verse, choosing his words with the same care he once brought to the goldsmith's bench. Nearby, in her own apartment, Hürrem is dictating a letter to a scribe, her voice low and measured, pausing occasionally to rephrase a sentence or to listen to the sound of her children, playing in the courtyard beyond the latticed screen. This was the private world of the most powerful couple in the Ottoman Empire, a world of poetry, correspondence and devotion, held together beneath the ever-present awareness that power in this palace was never truly secure. The final decades of Suleiman's reign were shadowed by a grief that the chronicles record with a kind of hushed restraint, as though even the court historians found it difficult to speak of directly. The source of that grief was a decision that Suleiman made, and that he could never unmake. In October of 1553, Suleiman's eldest surviving son, Shahzada Mustafa, was summoned to the Sultan's campaign tent in Anatolia. Mustafa was popular, perhaps too popular. He was admired by the Janissaries, respected by the provincial governors, and widely regarded as the most capable of Suleiman's sons. But that very popularity had made him dangerous, at least in the eyes of those who whispered in the Sultan's ear. Accusations of conspiracy had been brought, accusations that Mustafa was plotting to seize the throne, while his father still lived. Whether those accusations were true, we cannot know with certainty. The sources are contradictory, shaped by the loyalties of their authors and the political currents of the time. What is known is that when Mustafa entered his father's tent, he did not emerge. The details are sombre, and they need not detain us here. It is enough to say that the prince's life ended that day, and that the empire was never quite the same afterwards. The empire mourned. The Janissaries, who had loved Mustafa, wept openly. The poets wrote elegies, and Suleiman, if the chroniclers are to be believed, retreated into a silence that lasted for days. He had done what Ottoman political logic demanded. He had removed a threat to the stability of the succession, but the cost was beyond reckoning, and it was a cost that he bore, privately, for the rest of his life. Hurrem Sultan did not live to see the full consequences of this tragedy. She died in 1558, probably of illness, and Suleiman buried her in a magnificent turba, a mausoleum beside the mosque that bore his name, the Suleymaniye. It was an honour that spoke more eloquently than any poem of the depth of his attachment. For the remaining 8 years of his life, the Sultan was, by all accounts, a diminished figure, still capable, still commanding, but more withdrawn, more prone to long silences and solitary contemplation. Tonight, as you lie in the comfort of your own bed, consider for a moment the weight of such a life, the weight of ruling. An empire that spanned from Hungary to Yemen, of making decisions that affected millions of lives, of carrying the memory of choices that could never be taken back. We live in an age where power is diffused, shared, checked by institutions and laws and the slow, steady mechanisms of democratic process. Suleiman carried it alone. The crown, or rather the towering ceremonial turban that served as its Ottoman equivalent, rested on a single head, and the loneliness of that position is something that no amount of poetry or goldsmithing could entirely ease. The hours grew long, the years turned, and the world moved on, as it always does. In the spring of 1566, Suleiman set out on his final campaign. He was 71 years old, ancient by the standards of his time, and his health had been declining for years. He suffered from gout so severe that he could barely ride, and he was carried much of the way in a carriage, a concession to frailty that he reportedly despised. The destination was Hungary, where a small but strategically important fortress called Szigetvar was held by a defiant Croatian-Hungarian garrison under the command of Count Nikola Zrinski. The journey alone was an ordeal. Imagine for a moment the Sultan's vast army, tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry, artillery, supply wagons, herds of livestock, moving slowly northward through the Balkans along muddy, rutted roads. The rain fell for days. The rivers were swollen. The mud clung to boots and wheels and hooves with a cold, sucking tenacity that slowed the march to a crawl. Suleiman, inside his carriage, would have heard it all. The creak of axles, the muffled thud of hooves on soft ground, the calls of officers trying to keep the column moving, and, beneath it all, the relentless drumming of rain on the carriage roof. The air would have tasted of damp wool and wet leather, and the draught that crept through the carriage. Curtains carried the smell of churned earth and wood smoke, from the campfires that struggled to stay alight. The siege of Szigetvar began in August of 1566. The fortress was small but well defended, and Zrinski's garrison held out with a determination that surprised the Ottoman commanders. Week after week, the siege continued. Trenches were dug, mines were tunnelled beneath the walls. Assaults were launched and repelled. The September rains turned the siege works into a quagmire, and then, on the 6th of September, though even the exact date remains a matter of quiet scholarly discussion, Suleiman died. He died in his tent, in the camp before the walls of Sigetvar, surrounded by his physicians and his closest attendants. The cause was almost certainly natural, the accumulated toll of age, illness, and the exhaustion of a campaign that he should never have undertaken. What happened next has become one of the most famous episodes in Ottoman history. The Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, made the extraordinary decision to keep the Sultan's death a secret from the army. The body was embalmed in the strictest confidence. The physicians who had attended the Sultan were sworn to secrecy, and the inner circle of attendants was kept under the closest watch. Official orders continued to be issued in Suleiman's name. The army, unaware that their commander was gone, continued the siege. On the 7th of September, Zarinsky led a final, desperate sortie from the gates, and the fortress fell. Sigetvar was taken. Only then, some 48 days later, when the army had begun its long march back toward Istanbul, and the new Sultan, Selim II, had been secured upon the throne, was the death of Suleiman made public. The news spread through the ranks like a slow tide. Men wept. Officers rode in silence. The body was carried southward in the Sultan's carriage, the curtains drawn, as though he were merely resting. He was buried in Istanbul, in a turba beside the Süleymaniye Mosque, the mosque that bears his name, designed by the great architect Sinan, the mosque whose dome seems to float above the city's seventh hill, as though held aloft by nothing more than prayer and the weight of centuries. And there he lies still, in a chamber of Iznik, tile and soft lamplight, beneath a cenotaph draped in green cloth, while the city he ruled for 46 years continues to hum and change around him, century after century, as cities always do. This was the life of Suleiman the goldsmith, the poet, the lawgiver, the lover, the father whose reign was shadowed by an irrevocable choice. It was a life of immense power and immense solitude, of public grandeur and private sorrow, of verses written in the still hours of the night, and decisions made in the cold light of political necessity. He was not a simple man. He was not, by modern standards, always a good man, but he was, in every sense, a consequential one, and the empire he shaped would endure, in its essentials, for more than 3 centuries after his death. It was a world away from our own, and yet, in the poetry, in the love letters, in the grief of a father and the loneliness of a ruler, there is something that feels, across all those centuries, unmistakably human. Interlude. A moment of stillness on the Bosphorus. Let us pause here for a moment. We have walked a good distance already tonight through the narrow lanes of 16th-century Istanbul, and then through the long, eventful life of a sultan whose choices rippled across 3 continents. That is a great deal to have taken in. There is no need to hold it all in your mind. Let whatever remains remain, and let the rest drift away, like lantern light on dark water. Imagine, if you will, that you are sitting on the stone steps beside the Bosphorus. The stone is cool beneath you, not cold, not uncomfortable, just pleasantly cool. The kind of surface that has been warmed by the day's sun, and is only now beginning to let that warmth go. It is twilight. The sky above the Asian shore has turned a deep, soft violet, and the first stars are beginning to show. The water before you is dark and slow-moving, and it catches the light of passing caiques, small wooden boats carrying passengers from one shore to the other, their lanterns swaying gently with the current. You can hear the soft splash of oars. You can smell the salt and the seaweed, and the faintest trace of wood smoke from somewhere across the strait. Take a slow breath in, hold it for a moment, and let it go. There is no hurry. The night is long, and there is still much to see. The secrets of Ottoman architecture, the mysteries of hidden manuscripts, the world behind the palace walls. But all of that can wait. For now, just sit here and breathe, and let the water carry your thoughts gently downstream. When you are ready, we will continue. Segment 3. Mystery Archaeology Culture. Deep Dive. Secrets of Ottoman Architecture and Hidden Manuscripts. Let us shift our gaze now away from the lives of sultans and the rhythms of the street and towards something quieter, something that lingers long after the people who made it have turned to dust. We are going to talk about stone and ink and fire, about domes that have stood for 5 centuries, and manuscripts that have lain unread for nearly as long, about the things the Ottomans built, and the things they wrote down, and the things that, despite our best efforts, we still do not fully understand. This is the part of our journey where we slow down even further, where we stand inside a great mosque and simply look upward, where we turn the pages of a very old book and try to imagine the hands that made it, where we trace the curve of a painted tulip on a ceramic tile and wonder what it meant to the person who first drew it. There are mysteries here, not the dramatic kind, not buried treasure or secret codes, but the gentler kind, questions that have been debated for decades and that may never be fully answered. And there is beauty here too, the kind of beauty that was designed to last, and has. Let us begin with the man who, more than any other single individual, shaped the physical skyline of Istanbul as we know it today. His name was Sinan. In full, Mimar Koca Sinan, Ibn Abdülmenan Sinan, the great architect, son of Abdülmenan, and his story begins not in a workshop or a school of design, but in a small village in central Anatolia, sometime around 1489 or 1490, in a Christian family. Though the sources differ on his precise ethnic background, Sinan was recruited through the devshirme, the Ottoman system of child levy that we shall discuss in more detail shortly, and brought from his village as a young boy, converted to Islam, and enrolled in the rigorous training program that produced the empire's Janissary soldiers and its highest administrators. He was educated, drilled, and eventually assigned to the Imperial Corps of Military Engineers. For decades he served on campaigns across the empire, in Belgrade, in Rhodes, in Egypt, in Baghdad, in Corfu, designing bridges, fortifications, aqueducts and fieldworks. He learned, in other words, not from textbooks, but from the practical demands of keeping an army moving across 3 continents. How to span a river, how to shore up a wall, how to move water from one place to another across difficult terrain. It was not until 1538, when Sinan was already in his late 40s, an age at which most architects in the modern world would already be well into their careers, that he was appointed Mimarbaşı, the chief architect of the Ottoman Empire. The appointment came from Suleiman himself. It would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions the Sultan ever made. Over the next 50 years, Sinan held the post until his death in 1588. At the approximate age of 98 or 99 he designed, or supervised the construction of an almost bewildering number of buildings. The figures vary by source, but the most commonly cited tallies include over 80 large mosques, more than 50 smaller mosques, over 50 madrasas, over 30 palaces, nearly 20 mausolea, and dozens of bathhouses, bridges, aqueducts, hospitals, and caravanserais. The sheer volume of his output is difficult to take in all at once, but it is the quality, the innovation, and the structural daring of his greatest works that continue to fascinate architects and engineers to this day. Imagine yourself for a moment approaching the Süleymaniye Mosque, completed in 1557 on the crest of Istanbul's third hill. You have already glimpsed it from a distance in your mind's eye. We passed near it earlier in our journey. But now, step inside. The first sensation is space, an enormous luminous space that seems far larger than the building's exterior would suggest. The central dome rises to a height of approximately 53 metres, roughly the height of a modern 17-storey building, and it spans a diameter of just over 26 metres. The weight of the stone seems to vanish. Visitors across the centuries have reached for the same description, that the dome is not resting, but hovering, as though gravity had politely agreed to look the other way. And there is a reason for that impression. Sinan pierced the base of the dome with a ring of windows, closely spaced arched openings that flood the interior with natural light. At certain times of day, the sun pours through these windows in broad, dusty shafts, and the effect is of standing inside a lantern. The stone walls seem to dissolve. You are enclosed, and yet you feel open, as though the sky had lowered itself gently into the room. The acoustics are equally notable. A whisper at one end of the prayer hall can be heard, softly, but distinctly, at the other a distance of nearly 70 meters. This was not accidental. Sinan embedded hollow clay pots, acoustic resonators into the walls and dome structure, carefully positioned to amplify and distribute sound evenly throughout the space. A single imam's voice, unaided by any mechanical device, could reach every corner of a hall designed to hold thousands. In our age of microphones and amplifiers, this seems a charming curiosity. In the 16th century, it was a feat of applied physics that few in the world could have matched. But the question that has lingered for generations is, this was Sinan consciously competing with Hagia Sophia? Hagia Sophia, the great Byzantine cathedral completed in 537 under the Emperor Justinian, converted into a mosque after the Ottoman conquest of 1453, stands just a few kilometres from the Suleymaniye. Its dome, slightly broader than Sinan's, was for 1,000 years the largest enclosed space in the world. It was the building against which all subsequent domed structures in Istanbul were measured, and Sinan knew it intimately. He had studied it, repaired it, reinforced its buttresses. He understood its strengths and, crucially, its weaknesses. The cracks that appeared in the dome after earthquakes, the structural compromises that Justinian's architects had been forced to make in their haste to complete the building. In his own autobiographical writings dictated late in life to a poet friend, Sinan described the Shahzade Mosque, completed in 1548, as his apprentice work, the Suleymaniye as his journeyman work, and the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, completed around 1575, as his masterwork. The Selimiye's dome is marginally wider than Hagia Sophia's by roughly 1 metre, and Sinan is said to have noted this fact with quiet satisfaction. Others have suggested that the competition narrative is too simple, that Sinan was engaged in a far more subtle dialogue with the architectural traditions of both the Islamic and Byzantine worlds, absorbing, adapting and transforming, rather than trying to outdo. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. What is beyond dispute is that Sinan's buildings were designed to last, and last they have. Istanbul has been struck by numerous major earthquakes since these buildings were completed, including devastating ones in 1766 and 1999. The Suleymaniye and the Selimiye still stand. Their domes have not cracked, their walls have not buckled. The foundations which Sinan, drawing on his military engineering experience, designed with a flexibility that modern earthquake engineers have studied with admiration, have held. Close your eyes for a moment if you like, and imagine standing beneath that dome in the cool, echoing vastness of the prayer hall. The marble floor is smooth beneath your feet, cool even in summer. The air smells of old stone, and very faintly of the rose water that is sprinkled on the carpets before Friday prayers. If you were to touch your lips, you might taste the slight mineral trace of that ancient air, dry, cool and clean, like water drawn from a deep well. High above, a shaft of light moves slowly across the interior wall as the sun shifts, illuminating, for a brief moment, a panel of calligraphy painted in gold, the name of God, or a verse from the Quran, rendered in letters so fluid and so precise that they seem less like writing and more like breathing. And then the light moves on, and the letters fall back into shadow, and the silence of the mosque settles around you like a blanket. That was the world Sinan built, and it is, in its own quiet way, still with us. And so the centuries moved on, one into the next, as they always do. But let us turn now from stone to paper, from the buildings that survived to the writings that, in many cases, did not. The Ottoman Empire was, among many other things, a civilization of books. A scholar arriving at a madrasa library in the early morning might have been offered a small cup of unsweetened coffee, still warm, its bitter edge, softening as it cooled, a quiet ritual before the day's reading began. Manuscripts, handwritten, hand-bound, often hand-illustrated, were collected, copied, and treasured across the empire's vast territory. The great libraries of Istanbul, the madrasas of Cairo and Damascus, the private collections of wealthy scholars and provincial governors, all of these held thousands upon thousands of volumes in Arabic, Persian, Ottoman Turkish, Greek, Hebrew, Armenian, and other languages. They contained works of theology, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, geography, poetry, law, and history. They preserved texts that had been translated from Greek into Arabic during the Abbasid Golden Age, texts that had been copied from Persian originals in the courts of Samarkand and Herat, texts that existed in no other copy anywhere in the world, and many of them have been lost. This is not in itself unusual. Fires, floods, insects, and neglect have claimed untold millions of pages across every civilization. But the Ottoman case has a particular poignancy because the losses were often not dramatic. They were the result of quiet, forgetting storerooms locked and never reopened, catalogues, mislaid, scripts that fell out of use, until the books themselves became unreadable to later generations. Let your mind drift for a moment across the centuries. The transmission of manuscripts across the Islamic world is itself a story of quiet, almost infinite patience. A single text might begin its life in 9th century Baghdad, be copied by hand in 12th century Cairo, carried overland to 14th century Damascus, and finally find its way to an Ottoman library in Istanbul in the 16th century. Each copy introducing slight variations, marginalia, corrections and commentaries that tell their own story. Picture, if you will, the scale of what was nearly lost. When the Ottoman Empire was dissolved in the early 20th century and the modern Turkish Republic was established, one of the new government's reforms was the replacement of the Arabic script, in which Ottoman Turkish had been written for 6 centuries with the Latin alphabet. The reform was, in practical terms, a modernizing measure, but one of its unintended consequences was that within a generation, most Turkish citizens could no longer read the vast archives and libraries that their ancestors had created. Millions of documents, court records, letters, poetry collections, scientific treatises, property deeds became, overnight, as inaccessible, as if they'd been written in a foreign language, which, in a sense, they had. Scholars had been working for decades to catalogue and digitise these collections. In the 1990s, researchers cataloguing a neglected storeroom in the Suleymaniye Library came upon previously unknown works by medieval Islamic philosophers. The leather of the binding still supple, the subtle vanillary scent of old paper rising as each cover was opened for the first time in centuries. Similar discoveries followed at Al-Azhar in Cairo, and in small Ottoman-era libraries attached to rural mosques across the Balkans, where brittle pages and crumbling bindings concealed texts that had long been believed lost entirely. And yet, for every manuscript that has been found, there are others that remain tantalizingly beyond reach. The chronicles mention books that no modern reader has ever seen. Travellers' accounts describe libraries that have since vanished, without a trace. There are references in Ottoman court documents to scientific instruments, astronomical tables, and medical texts that were commissioned by sultans and delivered to the palace, but that are not in any known collection today. Where did they go? Were they destroyed? Were they sold? Were they moved to a different shelf, in a different room, in a building that has since changed hands a dozen times? Imagine yourself there now, in a narrow, climate-controlled reading room, the hum of a modern dehumidifier the only sound, and before you a folio that no one has opened since the reign of Sultan Ahmed III. The binding is cracked, the edges foxed with age. You lift the cover and the old leather yields with a slight creak. The text inside is legible, the ink still dark, the marginal notes still sharp. You are, in that moment, the first reader in 300 years. Today, the digitization of these archives has begun in earnest. A slow, painstaking process of photographing each page, tagging each text, and making it available anywhere in the world with an internet connection. What once required a physical journey to Istanbul or Cairo now requires only a few keystrokes. The manuscripts, of course, do not know the difference. They sit where they have always sat, patient, undemanding, their pages turned now by gloved hands under conservation lighting rather than by the bare fingers of a 16th-century student. But the knowledge they contain is at last beginning to travel once more. The world keeps its secrets patiently, and sometimes it gives them up only to those who are patient enough to look. One age gave way to the next, as it always does, and the words remained. There is, however, a more difficult subject woven into Ottoman history, one that involves not books or buildings, but people, and it is a subject that continues to be discussed with considerable care, because it touches on questions of identity, loyalty, coercion, and belonging that feel uncomfortably close to concerns of our own time. We touched on the Devshirme briefly when we discussed Sinan's origins. Now let us look at it more closely. The Devshirme, from the Turkish devşirmek, meaning to collect or to gather, was a system by which the Ottoman state periodically levied Christian boys from villages in the Balkans, and to a lesser extent Anatolia. The boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 18, were selected by imperial officials, separated from their families, converted to Islam, and sent to Istanbul for training. The most promising were educated in the palace school, the Enderun, where they learned Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Islamic theology, law, administration, and military science. The rest were trained as janissaries, the empire's elite infantry corps. The system produced some of the most powerful figures in Ottoman history. Grand viziers, provincial governors, admirals, and, as we have seen, the empire's greatest architect, were all products of the Devshirme. For the boys who rose to the highest positions, the system offered a degree of social mobility that would have been unthinkable in most other societies of the age. A Christian peasant's son from a Bosnian village could, within a single generation, become the second most powerful man in the empire. But the cost was significant. These boys were parted from their families, in most cases, for the rest of their lives. They were given new names, a new religion, a new language, and a new identity. Their ties to their birth communities were, in theory, severed completely. They belonged, from that moment onward, to the Sultan. They were kul, the Sultan's servants, bound by a loyalty that was personal, total, and in some ways deliberately isolating. They could not marry without permission. They could not, in the early centuries of the system, pass their wealth or position to their children. They existed in a space between freedom and servitude that does not map neatly onto any modern category. How did it feel? That is the question that is hardest to answer, and the one that matters most. Picture now a winter road in the Balkans, the crunch of packed snow underfoot, the grey sky pressing low, the sharp, clean scent of pine resin carried on the cold air, the breath of oxen rising in small, slow clouds. A group of boys walks in silence, their belongings bundled on their backs, an Ottoman official riding ahead. They do not know where they are going, not truly. They know only that the life they have known is behind them, and that something unknown waits ahead. Someone has given them bread for the journey. Coarse, dark bread that tastes of rye and hearth ash, the last flavour of home. The sources give us fragments. There are surviving petitions from Balkan families asking to be exempted from the levy, evidence that the system was, for many, a source of grief and dread. There are also, more surprisingly, petitions from Muslim families asking that their sons be included, evidence that, for some, The Devshirme was seen as an opportunity, a path to power and prosperity that was otherwise closed to them. There are memoirs, written decades later, by men who had risen through the system that describe their early years with a complex mixture of loss and gratitude, the ache of separation alongside the recognition that the education they received had transformed their lives in ways that their birth families could never have provided. And so the debate goes on, steadily, thoughtfully, as such debates always do. One perspective emphasises the coercive nature of the system, the removal of children, the compulsory conversion, the severing of family bonds. The other points to the opportunities it created, the genuine loyalty that many Devshirme graduates expressed in later life, and the fact that, by the standards of the 15th and 16th centuries, the Ottoman approach invested in its recruits more heavily than most. Both perspectives contain truth. Neither, alone, is sufficient. What we can say is that the Devshirme shaped young lives into instruments of governance methodically, over years, and with an investment in their education and care that was, paradoxically, a measure of how greatly the empire depended upon them. The boys who entered the system did not choose it. The men who emerged from it often defended it, and the empire that created it could not have functioned without it. Tonight, lying in the ease and safety of your own home, you have the luxury of contemplating such questions from a great distance. The children of the Devshirme did not have that luxury. Their choices, to the extent that they had choices, were made within a framework that we, from our vantage point of centuries, can study but cannot fully inhabit. It was a world with different assumptions, different possibilities, and different constraints, and the people who lived within it did what people always do. They adapted, they carried on, they found meaning where they could. Let us end this segment with something gentler, something beautiful. If you have ever seen an Ottoman mosque in a photograph, in a film, or, if you have been fortunate, in person, then you have almost certainly noticed the tiles, panels of ceramic tilework covering entire walls, sometimes entire interiors, in patterns of such intricacy and such vivid colour that they seem to glow with an inner light even in the dimmest room. These are the Iznik tiles, named after the town of Iznik in northwestern Anatolia, where they were produced, and they represent one of the highest achievements of Ottoman decorative art. The tradition began in the late 15th century, drawing on techniques inherited from the Seljuk Turks, the Persians, and, more distantly, the Chinese porcelain tradition that had reached the Islamic world via the Silk Road. The earliest Iznik tiles were relatively simple, blue and white designs, clearly influenced by Chinese ceramics, with floral and geometric patterns. But over the course of the 16th century, the palette expanded. Turquoise, green, and most famously a brilliant coral red known as Armenian bole were added to the repertoire. The coral red was a technical marvel. It was applied as a thick slip that stood slightly raised above the surface of the tile, giving it a tactile, almost three-dimensional quality. Run your fingertip across an Iznik tile gently, very gently, and you can feel the red petals of a tulip standing proud of the glazed background, like tiny ridges of dry paint. The motifs were drawn from nature, but they were not naturalistic. The tulip, which the Ottomans cultivated with a devotion that long predated the Dutch tulip mania of the 17th century, appeared in stylized, elongated forms that bore only a passing resemblance to the actual flower. The carnation, the hyacinth, the rose, the pomegranate, the artichoke, and the vine all featured in repertoires that were passed down from master to apprentice over generations. Cypress trees, symbols of eternity and paradise in Islamic art, appeared in slender, tapering silhouettes, and winding through it all, like a slow river through a garden, were the arabesques flowing curvilinear patterns of leaves and stems that had no beginning and no end, designed to suggest the infinite, the eternal, the divine order that underlies the apparent chaos of the natural world. Let your breathing slow, just a little, and stay with this image a moment longer. The process of making an Iznik tile was long and unhurried. The The workshop air carried the chalky mineral scent of ground quartz and the dry warmth of the kiln. The body of the tile, the quartz-rich clay that gave it its characteristic whiteness, was shaped, dried, and then coated with a thin layer of white slip. The design was transferred onto this surface, sometimes by pricking tiny holes in a paper template and dusting charcoal powder through them, a technique called pouncing, and sometimes by freehand drawing. The colours were then applied, each one separately, using brushes made from cat hair or squirrel hair, and the tile was fired in a kiln at temperatures that had to be controlled with great precision. Too hot and the colours would bleed or burn. Too cool and the glaze would not fuse properly. The coral red was particularly temperamental. It required a narrow temperature range, and even experienced potters could not always guarantee its consistency. The finished tiles were transported from Iznik to Istanbul, a journey of 2 or 3 days by cart, and fitted into place by teams of specialist craftsmen. Close your eyes and think of this. A newly completed mosque interior, the scaffolding just removed, the morning light pouring through freshly glazed windows onto walls that are, for the first time, fully visible. Thousands of tiles, each one hand-painted, each one individually fired, each one slightly different from its neighbours, and yet part of a seamless whole. The blue is luminous, a deep, saturated cobalt that seems to pulse with its own light. The red catches the eye like a warm spark. The white background is clean and cool, and against it, the flowers and vines and arabesques unfurl in patterns that draw your gaze. Along and along and along, without ever arriving at an end. It is a form of visual meditation. That was, in fact, one of its purposes. Islamic decorative art was not ornament for ornament's sake. It was theological. The patterns were designed to lead the eye, and, through the eye, the mind away from the material world and toward the contemplation of the divine. The absence of representational images, no faces, no figures, no animals, was not a limitation, but a liberation. Without the distraction of narrative, the viewer was free to lose themselves in pure form, pure colour, pure pattern. The tiles were not pictures of paradise. They were, in a very real sense, an attempt to create the experience of paradise. The sense of boundless beauty and perfect order here, now, on the wall of a mosque, in a noisy, crowded, imperfect city. By the late 17th century, the Iznik tile industry had declined, a consequence of falling imperial patronage, rising costs, and the gradual loss of the technical knowledge that had made the coral red possible. When imperial commissions dwindled, the workshops of Iznik fell silent one by one, and the precise recipes for their most vivid pigments slipped out of common knowledge. The kilns cooled, the workshops were abandoned, and the tiles that had already been placed on the walls of the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, the Rustem Pasha Mosque, the Topkapı Palace became relics of a craft that no one alive could any longer practice. But they remain. They remain in the way that all truly beautiful things persist, not by force, not by argument, but by being. A visitor who walks into the Rustem Pasha Mosque today, in the 21st century, will see exactly what a visitor in 1563 would have seen. The same cobalt, blue, the same coral red, the same tulips and carnations and arabesques, glowing in the same soft light. The glaze has not faded. The colours have not dimmed. The tile is patient. It waits. It does not care how many centuries pass, or who is looking, or whether anyone is looking at all. The rhythmic scratch of a calligrapher's column tracing Bismillah in gold ink, the glint of cobalt blue glaze catching lamplight on a wall, the dry, papery scent of centuries-old parchment. These are the textures of a civilization that believed, profoundly, in the permanence of beautiful things, in the idea that what is made with care and devotion and skill will outlast the hands that made it, the empire that commissioned it, and the centuries that tried and failed to wear it away. And so they have. Now let us turn from the things that were built and written and fired in kilns, and step behind the walls of the most celebrated building in the empire, the place where power lived and whispered and watched from behind latticed screens. Let us enter the Topkapı Palace. Segment 4. Society Elite. Contrasting life inside the Topkapı Palace and the lives of the Ottoman elite. Now let us pass through a gate that most residents of Istanbul would never have been permitted to enter. We have walked the streets. We have sat in the coffee house. We have traced the curve of a tile and the arc of a sultan's life. But all of that has taken place, as it were, on the outside in the city, among the people, under the open sky. Now we are going inward, behind the walls, into the place where power did not simply reside, but breathed and watched and waited in silence. The Topkapı Palace. From the outside, it does not look like what most people imagine when they hear the word palace. There is no single grand facade, no sweeping staircase, no Versailles-like assertion of symmetry and spectacle. Instead, the Topkapı is a sprawling compound of low buildings, courtyards, gardens, kiosks and pavilions spread across a promontory at the eastern tip of Istanbul's historic peninsula, where the Golden Horn meets the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara. It was begun by Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror in the 1460s, shortly after the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, and it was expanded, modified and embellished by nearly every sultan who came after him for the next 4 centuries. By the 16th century, the period we are most concerned with tonight, it housed somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 people, and yet, despite its population, the defining quality of the Topkapı was not noise or bustle, it was stillness. Stillness was the currency of the palace. Quiet was power. Silence was protocol. And to understand the Topkapı, you must first understand this. The deeper you penetrated into the palace compound, the further you moved from the public gate toward the Sultan's private chambers, the quieter the world became. The outermost courtyard was open to the public petitioners, soldiers, foreign envoys, merchants delivering goods. The second courtyard, where the imperial council met, was quieter, accessible only to officials and those with business before the divan. The third courtyard, which housed the palace school and the Sultan's private audience chamber, was quieter still. And the fourth courtyard, the innermost sanctum, with its gardens and its kiosks overlooking the water, was, by all accounts, almost perfectly hushed. Servants communicated in sign language. Pages moved on soft-soled slippers that made no sound on the polished marble floors. Even the birds, it was said, seemed to sing more softly here. Imagine yourself there, just for a moment. You are standing in the second courtyard on a morning when the divan is in session. The courtyard is vast, an open rectangle of raked gravel and carefully trimmed cypress. Trees flanked on one side by the soaring chimneys of the palace kitchens, and on the other by the colonnaded entrance to the divan chamber. The air smells of cut grass and stone, and, faintly, of the wood fires burning in the kitchens. You can hear just barely the muffled voices of the council members deliberating behind closed doors, and above the divan chamber, behind a screened window, covered with a gilded grille, the Sultan may or may not be listening. You cannot see him. You are not meant to see him. But you know everyone knows that the window is there, and that at any moment a curtain might twitch, a shadow might shift, and the entire course of a council debate might change because a single, unseen pair of eyes has been watching. This was the architecture of authority. Not grandeur for its own sake, although there was plenty of that, but grandeur in the service of control. Every courtyard, every gate, every corridor was designed to remind those who entered that they were moving deeper into a world governed by rules they could not see and a power they could not predict. And so the hours passed, marked not by clocks but by the slow migration of sunlight across marble and by the measured tread of men who understood that haste in this place was its own kind of confession. Let us walk a little further, past the divan, past the cypress trees, and toward the place that has, for centuries, been the subject of more fantasy, more misunderstanding, and more romanticized distortion than almost any other institution in Ottoman history. The harem. The word itself, from the Arabic harim, meaning sacred or forbidden, tells you something important. The harem was not, as countless European paintings and novels have suggested, a pleasure garden populated by languishing concubines awaiting the Sultan's attention. It was a household, a very large, very complex, and very powerful household, a residential and administrative compound that housed the Sultan's mother, his wives, his concubines, his daughters, his younger sons, and the hundreds of female servants and attendants who managed the daily operations of what was, in effect, a parallel court. And at the apex of this parallel court stood a figure of formidable authority, the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother. The power of the Valide Sultan is difficult to overstate. In the Ottoman system, the Sultan's mother held a formal, recognized position at the top of the harem hierarchy, and her influence frequently extended well beyond the domestic sphere, into the realms of politics, diplomacy, and imperial patronage. She managed the harem's substantial budget. She controlled access to the Sultan, a power of real significance, in a system where physical proximity to the ruler was the primary currency of political influence. She corresponded with foreign leaders. She commissioned mosques, hospitals, and charitable endowments. And in times of political crisis, when sultans were young or weak or distracted, she sometimes governed in all but name. The period from roughly 1533 to 1656 is sometimes called the Sultanate of Women, a term coined by later historians to describe an era in which a succession of capable women wielded influence from within the harem that shaped the fate of the empire. Harem Sultan, whom we met earlier, was the first and likely the most famous of these figures, but she was followed by others who were, in their own ways, equally significant. Nobanu Sultan, believed to have been of Venetian origin, the wife of Selim II and mother of Murad III, maintained a correspondence with Catherine de' Medici of France and played a meaningful role in Ottoman-Venetian diplomacy. Sophia Sultan, originally from Albania, served as chief consort to Murad III and wielded still greater influence during the reign of her son, Mehmed III. She was known for her keen political instincts and her carefully maintained connections within and beyond the palace walls. And Kösem Sultan, by many accounts the most powerful of them all, effectively governed the empire as regent during the reigns of two of her sons and one of her grandsons, spanning a period of more than 3 decades. Kösem's story is worth pausing over. Born Anastasia, probably of Greek origin, she entered the harem as a young girl and rose, through intelligence, charm, and political acumen, to become the favourite of Sultan Ahmed I. After Ahmed's death, she navigated the treacherous politics of 4 successive reigns, placing her sons on the throne, managing the empire's affairs, with a steady hand that earned her both admiration and, inevitably, enemies. Her end, when it came, was the result of a power struggle with another woman, Tuahan Hatice Sultan, the mother of the young Mehmed IV, who saw Kösem's influence as a threat to her own position and her son's independence. Kösem was removed from power in 1651. We need not dwell on the particulars. It is enough to know that power, in this palace, exacted its own cost. What matters is the scale of what she achieved for over 30 years. A woman who had entered the palace without rank or name governed one of the largest empires on earth. It was a world away from our own. And yet, the ambitions, the quiet, patient, strategic ambitions, would not have been entirely unfamiliar. The women of the harem were not idle. Their education was rigorous and comprehensive. They studied languages Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, Persian, as well as music, embroidery, calligraphy, household management, and, for the most senior among them, political strategy and diplomatic protocol. The harem had its own hierarchy, its own career structure, its own system of promotion and reward. A woman who entered at the lowest level might, over years of service and demonstrated competence, rise to positions of genuine authority, managing the harem's finances, overseeing its staff, or serving as a trusted advisor to the Valide Sultan herself. Close your eyes now, if they are not already closed, and picture the interior of the harem quarters. The rooms are intimate, smaller than you might expect, with low ceilings, tiled walls in patterns of blue and white and coral red, thick carpets, underfoot, and cushions arranged along the walls in rows of muted crimson and gold. The light is soft, filtered through latticed windows that allow air and sunlight in, while preventing anyone outside from seeing in. The sound is muffled footsteps on carpet, the quiet splash of a fountain in an interior courtyard, the gentle rustle of silk, and, somewhere down a corridor, the sound of a woman practicing the oud, her fingers, plucking a slow, melancholy melody in one of the Ottoman makam modes. The air smells of ambergris and sandalwood, of the rose water that is used to scent the rooms, and of the strong, sweet coffee that is served to the senior women in their private apartments. If you could taste that coffee brewed slowly in a long-handled chesva over a low flame, the ground settling like dark silt, it would be thick and bitter and faintly sweet, with a warmth that lingered on the tongue long after the last sip. It is a world of great refinement, and it is a world of great constraint. The women of the harem lived in luxury by the standards of their time, but they lived behind walls. Their movements were circumscribed. Their contacts with the outside world were mediated through eunuchs and trusted servants. And the politics of the harem, the rivalries between concubines, the competition to bear a son, the alliances and betrayals that determined who would rise and who would fall, were conducted with an intensity that rivaled anything in the divan. The stakes, after all, were the same: proximity to the Sultan, influence, survival. And so the days went on, behind those latticed screens. Days of study and prayer and quiet strategy, of embroidered silks and whispered conversations, of women who held the fate of an empire in hands that the empire's subjects would never see. But let us step back out into the more public spaces of the palace, where power was displayed rather than concealed, and where the rituals of Ottoman court life reached their fullest expression. Let us talk about food. The Topkapı kitchens were, by any standard, an immense operation. Located along the eastern side of the second courtyard, they consisted of a row of 10 domed chambers, each with its own massive chimney, and they employed a staff of several hundred cooks, bakers, confectioners, sherbet makers, and kitchen servants. At their peak, the kitchens produced between 4,000 and 5,000 meals every single day, feeding the Sultan, the harem, the palace school, the divan members, the janissary guards, the servants, the eunuchs, and the various officials, artisans, and attendants who lived and worked within the palace compound. The food served to the Sultan and the senior elite was, as you might expect, of a different order entirely from the simple stew and pilaf that an ordinary Istanbul household would have eaten. An imperial banquet might consist of dozens of courses, served in a sequence that followed strict protocols of rank and precedence. There would be soups, lentil, yogurt, lamb broth flavoured with mint, and sumac, each one carried in a covered copper bowl from the kitchen to the dining chamber, the metal warm to the touch, the steam escaping from beneath the lid, carrying with it the soft herbal sweetness of the broth within. There would be kebabs, not the simple grilled meat of the street vendor, but intricate constructions of minced lamb mixed with pistachios and spices, wrapped in thin layers of pastry, or served on beds of saffron-scented rice. There would be pilafs, plain rice, bulgur, pilaf, studded with dried fruits and pine nuts, each grain separate, each grain glistening faintly with clarified butter. There would be borek, layers of paper-thin yufka pastry filled with cheese or spinach or minced meat, baked until golden and flaky, so that the first bite yielded a soft crack, and then a yielding warmth of salted cream. And there would be sweets baklava, of course, its layers compressed and golden, the honey in crushed pistachios pooling in the diamond-shaped cuts, but also helva, a dense, crumbly confection of sesame, paste and sugar, and lokum, the soft, powdery confection that the Europeans would later call Turkish delight, flavoured with rosewater or mastic or bergamot, and dusted so thickly with powdered sugar that it left a pale smudge on your fingers long after you had finished. Let your mind rest here for a moment, among the slow aromas of the kitchen. The heady sweetness of saffron and rosewater rising from the palace kitchens, the muffled clatter of Chinese porcelain, the Topkapı collection of Chinese, celadon and blue and white porcelain is one of the largest in the world, accumulated over centuries of trade and diplomatic gifts, being carried by a procession of servants through the corridors, the faint sizzle of meat on a charcoal grill, the cool, perfumed sweetness of sherbet fruit juice mixed with sugar and chilled. In the warmer months, with snow brought by runners from the slopes of Uludağ, the great mountain to the south of Bursa, packed in straw and transported through the night so that it arrived at the palace still frozen. Tonight, if you wished, you could open your refrigerator and pour yourself a glass of cold water or juice, or milk without a moment's thought. In the 16th century, the ability to chill a drink required a mountain, a team of runners, several hours of hard labour, and a supply chain that stretched across 200 kilometres of Anatolian countryside. The cold sherbet that the Sultan sipped on a hot August afternoon represented an almost absurd expenditure of human effort. And yet, it was expected. It was routine. That was how things were, in a world where the ordinary comforts we take for granted tonight had to be summoned at great cost from the landscape itself. Fashion was another marker of the separation between palace and street, and it was governed by rules as strict and as legible as any legal code. Ottoman sumptuary laws dictated, with specificity, what each class and community within the empire was permitted to wear, the colour of one's turban, the fabric of one's robe, the style of one's shoes. All of these conveyed information about rank, religion, and profession. Descendants of the Prophet were entitled to wear green turbans. Scholars of religion often wore white. The Sultan's court had its own gradations of colour and fabric, and the Sultan alone could wear certain furs and particular shades of cloth, reserved exclusively for the throne. Non-Muslim subjects were required to wear clothing that distinguished them from Muslims typically, specific colours or styles of headgear, though the strictness with which these rules were enforced varied over time and from place to place. The weight of an elite Ottoman kaftan, a full-length robe of brocaded silk, often lined with sable or ermine fur, and sometimes embroidered with gold thread, was substantial, literally. A surviving kaftan from the Topkapı collection weighs several kilograms. Wearing it for a full day of court ceremonies in the heat of an Istanbul summer must have been a quiet physical ordeal, the silk clinging to the skin, the fur lining trapping the warmth, the stiff brocade resisting every casual movement. And yet the kaftan was not merely clothing, it was a statement of status. A gift of the Sultan, kaftans were bestowed upon favoured officials as marks of honour, and a visual reinforcement of the rigid hierarchy that governed every aspect of palace life. You wore what you were told to wear, you stood where you were told to stand, you spoke when you were spoken to, and you did it all in the knowledge that the Sultan or his agents were always watching. Life, as it always does, carried on, measured out in silk and ceremony and the careful performance of obedience, which brings us, at last, to the man who bore the greatest burden of all, the man who stood between the Sultan and the empire, who carried the weight of governance on his shoulders, and who lived every single day with the knowledge that his power could be stripped away in an instant. The Grand Vizier. In the Ottoman system, the Grand Vizier, the Sadrazam, was the Sultan's chief minister, the head of the imperial council, the supreme commander of the army in the 20th Sultan's absence, and the man ultimately responsible for the day-to-day administration of an empire that spanned 3 continents. His authority was immense. He could issue decrees, appoint officials, negotiate with foreign powers, and command military campaigns. He wore the imperial seal, the Mur-u-Humayun, around his neck, a physical emblem of his delegated authority. In many practical respects, he was the most powerful man in the empire, and he was also, at every moment, completely at the mercy of the Sultan's will. A Grand Vizier could be dismissed without warning. He could be stripped of his property. He could be exiled to a remote province. And, in a number of well-documented cases, he could be removed permanently, sometimes for genuine offences, sometimes for perceived disloyalty, and sometimes for no clearly recorded reason at all. The Ottoman chroniclers kept meticulous lists of the dozens of men who served as Grand Vizier during the classical period. A striking proportion did not leave the post peacefully. The position was, in the most literal sense, a gamble, and the men who accepted it knew the odds. Picture a typical day. The Grand Vizier rises before dawn, long before the Sultan, who is not expected to attend the early hours of administration. He dresses in his ceremonial robes, the heavy kaftan, the towering turban, the imperial seal on its chain, the cold metal resting against his chest as a constant reminder of both his authority and his dependence. He makes his way to the divan chamber, where the council is already assembling. The air inside is cool, despite the growing warmth outside, and it carries the dry, formal scent of sealing wax and fresh-pressed paper. The smell, if power had a smell, of decisions being made. The Grand Vizier takes his seat at the head of the council table. Before him are stacked the documents that have arrived overnight, reports from provincial governors, petitions from subjects, diplomatic correspondence from Venice, from Vienna, from the Safavid court in Persia, written in Italian, Latin, German, Persian, Arabic, a babel of languages, each requiring its own translator, its own protocol, its own carefully calibrated response. The council deliberates. Cases are heard. A merchant from Aleppo complains that his goods were confiscated by a corrupt customs official. A provincial governor requests reinforcements for a border fortress. A Venetian ambassador presents his credentials and, with elaborate courtesy, delivers a message that is, beneath the flowery language, a thinly veiled expression of displeasure. Each of these matters requires a decision, and each decision carries consequences that may not become apparent for months or years. The Grand Vizier listens, questions, consults, and rules, all while aware that behind the gilded lattice above him, the Sultan may be watching, judging, and forming opinions that will never be spoken aloud, but that may, one day, determine whether the Vizier retains his post or loses everything he has built. By midday, the divan session ends, and the Grand Vizier moves on to a series of private audiences, with military commanders, with the chief architect, with the head of the treasury, with foreign envoys who prefer to conduct their most sensitive negotiations away from the formality of the council chamber. He eats a meal, probably at his desk, probably quickly, the food growing cold on the porcelain plate, as another document is placed before him, and another seal is pressed into warm wax. The evening brings no rest. There are social obligations dinners with senior officials, receptions for visiting dignitaries, the need to maintain alliances and monitor rivals within the court, and there is the ever-present, exhausting necessity of managing the Sultan's moods, anticipating his wishes, deflecting his displeasure, accepting responsibility for failures that may not have been the Vizier's fault, and sharing none of the credit for successes that were. It was, in its way, the loneliest position in the empire. The Grand Vizier could trust no one completely. His subordinates might be angling for his position. His allies might abandon him if the political wind shifted. And the Sultan, the one man whose approval mattered above all else, was, by design, inscrutable. The latticed window did not reveal what the eyes behind it were thinking, and yet men competed fiercely for the role. They cultivated networks of patronage and obligation over decades. all for the chance to hold the imperial seal, to sit at the head of the divan, and to live, for however long it lasted, at the very centre of power. The risks were known, the rewards were known, and the choice, for those ambitious and capable enough to reach the threshold, was apparently not difficult. The hours passed, the days turned, and the world behind those walls carried on, a world of silk and watchfulness, where a sultan's glance could elevate or undo a career, where a mother's counsel could alter the direction of governance, where the most powerful man in the empire ate his lunch at his desk and slept, if he slept at all, with one ear turned toward the corridor. Interlude. B. A breath between two worlds. We have lingered here long enough. The courtyards of Topkapı are beautiful, but they are not restful, not for those who lived within them, and not, perhaps, for us, who have been peering through the lattice screens and listening at the edges of power for some time now. It is time to leave the capital behind. It is time to breathe different air. Let us pause here for a moment and take a breath. We have spent the first half of our journey in the heart of the empire, in the streets of 16th-century Istanbul, in the company of sultans and architects and grand viziers, behind the walls of the most celebrated palace in the world. It has been a long walk and a rich one, and if you have drifted off somewhere along the way, that is perfectly all right. The story will be here whenever you return. Now, gently, we are going to leave all of that behind. Imagine stepping out through the great gate of Istanbul, past the city walls, and onto a road that leads away from the capital, southward, eastward, into the vast interior of the empire. Imagine boarding a wooden ship that creaks softly as it crosses the Aegean, or joining a slow caravan of camels and donkeys moving along the old Hajj road, their hooves raising little clouds of dust in the afternoon heat. The empire was always more than Istanbul. It was the wheat fields of Anatolia, the mountain villages of the Balkans, the olive groves of Palestine, the minarets of Cairo. And it is to these quieter places, further from the throne and centuries later in time, that we are now headed. Take another slow breath. Let your shoulders settle. Feel the gentle rhythm of the road beneath you and let it carry you forward. When you are ready, we will continue into the 19th century, into the countryside, into a world that moves to a very different pace. Segment 5, Daily Life Immersion 2, a season in a 19th century Anatolian village. We have travelled a long way from the capital now. The marble courtyards are behind us, the latticed windows, the silent pages in their silk slippers, the grand vizier hunched over his mountain of correspondence. All of that belongs to a different world. The world we are entering now is quieter, slower, and in many ways, older. It is a world that the reformers in Istanbul were trying very hard to change, and that, despite their best efforts, changed only at its own unhurried pace. It is the 1850s, the Tanzimat, the great programme of Ottoman modernisation that began in 1839 with the Gülhane Edict is now well underway. In Istanbul, new law codes are being drafted, new schools are being opened, new ministries are being created on European models. The telegraph is arriving, newspapers are being published in the capital. The empire, from the top down, is trying to reinvent itself. But here, in a village on the central Anatolian plateau, somewhere between Konya and Kayseri, let us say, where the land is flat and dry, and the sky is enormous. Very little of that has arrived yet. The telegraph lines have not reached this far. The newspapers are written in a language and a script that most villagers cannot read. The new law codes are known only as distant rumours, carried by the occasional government official who passes through on horseback, stays for a night, asks awkward questions about tax receipts, and then disappears back down the road toward the provincial capital. Here, life turns on older rhythms, the seasons, the soil, the prayer call, the harvest. And it is into this unhurried, ancient, endlessly repetitive world that we are going to settle now, for a little while. You wake in a farmhouse. It is not like the timber house in Istanbul that we visited earlier in our journey. This house is built of stone rough, undressed. Local stone, grey-brown in colour, stacked thick to hold the winter cold at bay with a timber-framed upper story and a flat earthen roof that is, depending on the season, either baking in the sun or buried under 1/2 metre of snow. The walls inside are whitewashed, but the whitewash is old and flaking, and the stone beneath shows through in patches. The floor is packed earth, covered with woven kilims that are faded and thin from years of use, but still retain their geometric patterns in muted reds and indigos. There is a single room downstairs that serves as both kitchen and living space. Upstairs, reached by a narrow wooden ladder, is the sleeping area, little more than a low platform spread with cotton mattresses and heavy woolen blankets. The air inside the house smells of wood smoke. It always smells of wood smoke. The central hearth, a clay-lined pit called a tanda, set into the floor, around which the family gathers for warmth in winter, is the heart of the home, and its smoke permeates everything. The walls, the blankets, your clothing, your hair, the very grain of the wooden beams overhead. It is not an unpleasant smell, exactly, it is earthy, resinous, mildly sweet when the fuel is dried, dung mixed with straw, sharper when it is scrub oak or thorn bush, but it is inescapable. If you lived here, you would stop noticing it within days. It would become the smell of home. You rise before dawn. The rooster has already crowed twice, and the grey light filtering through the small, unglazed window tells you that sunrise is no more than 20 minutes away. The air is cold. Spring has come to the plateau, but spring in central Anatolia is not the gentle affair that the word conjures in milder climates. The nights are still bitter. Frost still whitens the ground most mornings. The warmth, when it comes, will arrive suddenly, fiercely, and it will be followed almost immediately by the relentless dry heat of summer. But that is still weeks away. For now, you pull the woolen blanket tighter around your shoulders and listen to the sounds of the village. Stirring a dog barking, a door creaking open, the low murmur of a neighbour's voice calling to his son, and rising above it all, the call to prayer, sung not from a towering minaret, but from the low, modest roof of the village mosque, by an imam whose voice you have known since childhood. This was the rhythm of waking. Every morning, the same sounds, in the same order, as dependable as the sunrise itself. Spring planting is the great communal labour of the year, and it has begun. The crops that sustain this village and the thousands of villages like it scattered across the Anatolian plateau are wheat, barley, lentils and chickpeas. These are not glamorous crops. They do not feature in the lavish descriptions of palace banquets that we encountered earlier, but they are the foundation of Ottoman rural life, the staples that feed the family, pay the taxes, and, if the harvest is good, provide a modest surplus to sell at the nearest market town. The ploughing is done with a simple wooden plough, a carousabon pulled by a pair of oxen. The plough has an iron-tipped share, but the frame is wood, shaped by the village carpenter from local timber, and it has not changed in its basic design for centuries. It does not turn the soil in the deep, clean furrows that a modern plough would produce. It scratches the surface, opens a shallow trench, and moves on. The work is slow. The oxen are steady but unhurried, and the man, guiding the plough, must lean his weight into the handles to keep the share at the right depth, his feet slipping occasionally on the damp earth, his shoulders aching by mid-morning. Picture yourself there for a moment, standing at the edge of a ploughed field after the first spring rain. The earthy fragrance of freshly turned Anatolian soil, there is a richness to it, a density that is different from the smell of garden soil or forest floor. This is steppe earth dry, chalky, mineral heavy, and starved for moisture through the long winter. When the rain finally comes, and it comes in short, violent bursts in spring, the clouds piling up over the mountains to the south, and then sweeping across the plateau in dark curtains, the soil drinks it in greedily, and for a few hours The whole landscape smells alive. The scent rises from the ground in waves, wet clay, iron, something faintly vegetal like crushed grass. You breathe it in, and it fills your chest, and for a moment, the world feels full of possibility. The planting is communal. Families work their own plots, but they help one another, an arrangement called imeche, a tradition of mutual aid that binds the village together, as effectively as any written contract. When one family's field needs ploughing, the neighbours come. When the wheat needs harvesting, everyone turns out. The favour is repaid in kind, not in cash, and the accounting is kept not in ledgers, but in memory, in the unspoken understanding that what you give will be returned, and that the survival of each family depends on the cooperation of all. The village headman, the muhtar, oversees this system with a light touch. He is not an appointed official, exactly, nor an elected one in the modern sense. He is a respected elder, chosen by consensus, who serves as the village's representative to the outside world. He collects the taxes, settles minor disputes, hosts government officials when they pass through, and maintains the village's register of births, deaths, and property. His authority rests not on a title or a uniform, but on his reputation for fairness, his knowledge of local custom, and his ability to keep the peace without resorting to the distant and often distrusted machinery of the imperial courts. And so the days of planting went on, one much like the next, measured not by the clock, but by the angle of the sun, the ache in the shoulders, and the gradual progress of the furrows across the field. At the heart of the village, both physically and spiritually, stands the mosque. It is a small building, a single room, 10 metres by 8 or so, with a low dome or a flat timber roof, a modest mihrab indicating the direction of Mecca, and a minaret that is really little more than a raised platform with a railing. There are no Iznik tiles here, no soaring dome, no calligraphy in gold. The walls are whitewashed plaster. The floor is covered with simple straw mats, replaced once a year. The imam, the same man who calls the faithful each morning, leads the prayers, teaches the village children the rudiments of Quranic recitation, and serves as a kind of community registrar and gentle moral presence. But the mosque is not the only centre of spiritual life in this village. A short walk from the main square, along a path that winds between stone walls and past a grove of apricot trees, whose blossoms have just begun to open, pale, papery, and softly fragrant in the cool morning air, stands a tek, a Sufi lodge. Sufism, the mystical, contemplative tradition within Islam, had deep roots in Anatolia. The great Sufi orders, the Mevlevi, the Bektashi, the Naqshbandi, the Halveti, had established lodges across the Ottoman countryside over the course of centuries, and they played a role in rural life that was quite distinct from the formal, legalistic Islam of the mosque. The tekke was a place of dhikr, the repetitive chanting or recitation of the names of God, performed in a circle, sometimes accompanied by rhythmic breathing, swaying, or, in the case of the Mevlevi dervishes, the turning rotation that was itself a form of prayer. It was also a place of hospitality, fellowship, and teaching. Travelling strangers could find a meal and a bed at the tekke. Villagers who were troubled in mind or spirit could seek counsel from the sheikh who led it. And on certain evenings the tekke would open its doors for a communal gathering, a sohbet, at which the sheikh would speak about the spiritual life, passages from the Quran, or the poetry of Rumi or Yunus. Emre would be discussed, and coffee would be served in small cups, the bitter, dark liquid warming the hands as the conversation unfolded, the low, repetitive hum of a Sufi dhikr circle in a candle-lit tekke. Imagine that sound now, if you will. It is not a melody, exactly. It is a vibration, a deep, throaty, rhythmic chanting of a single phrase. La ilaha illallah. There is no God. But God repeated again and again, slowly at first, then a little faster, the voices of 10 or 15 men merging into a single, pulsing sound that fills the small room and seems to resonate somewhere deep in your chest. The candlelight flickers with each exhalation. The air smells of tallow and sweat and the dried herbs that have been scattered on the floor. Sage, perhaps, or wild thyme gathered from the hillside. The sheikh sits at the centre, eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer, and the sound continues on and on, rising and falling, until the boundary between the listener and the listened to begins to soften, and there is only the chanting and the breath and the darkness and the light. But the spiritual landscape of this village was even more layered than the coexistence of mosque and tekke might suggest. In 19th-century Anatolia, a rich stratum of folk belief persisted beneath and alongside Orthodox Islamic practice. Villagers visited sacred springs believed to have healing properties, and tied strips of cloth to the branches of trees beside these springs as votive offerings. Hilltop shrines, often dedicated to local saints or holy figures, whose identities blended Islamic and pre-Islamic traditions, were sites of pilgrimage and prayer. Amulets inscribed with Quranic verses were worn to ward off illness and misfortune, and in some communities, particularly those of the Alawi tradition, a heterodox form of Islam with its own distinctive rituals, including mixed-gender worship and the veneration of Ali ibn Abi Talib. The spiritual life of the village took forms that would have been quite unfamiliar to the Orthodox Sunni scholars of Istanbul. None of this was hidden. None of it was, in most cases, actively suppressed. The Ottoman state, for all its administrative reach, generally adopted a pragmatic approach to the spiritual diversity of its provinces, as long as taxes were paid and public order maintained. The precise nature of a village's religious practices was largely a matter of local custom. The imam and the sheikh coexisted. The mosque and the tekke stood side by side, and the villagers, who saw no contradiction in praying at the mosque on Friday and visiting the sacred spring on Saturday, carried their faith as people have always carried faith, not as a rigid system of doctrine, but as a living, breathing, slightly untidy part of daily life. It was a world of steady devotion, and it asked for very little in return. The weeks unfolded, one into the next, and the village moved on at its own ancient, unhurried pace. But let us shift our attention now to the people whose work sustained the village most directly, and whose contributions were, until relatively recently, the least recorded by history: the women. A woman's day in a 19th-century Anatolian village began, like everyone else's, before dawn, but her work was, in many ways, more continuous, more varied, and more physically demanding than the seasonal work of the fields. The fields had their rhythms of effort and rest. The ploughing ended, the harvest ended, but the domestic economy, the cooking, the baking, the spinning, the weaving, child-rearing, the tending of the kitchen garden, the care of the sick had no off-season. It continued every day, all year, without pause. The first task of the morning, after the fire was lit, was bread. Flatbread yufka, or baslama, depending on the region, was the staple of the Anatolian diet, and it was baked fresh every day, or, in some households, every 2 or 3 days in large batches. The tandoor was heated with dried dung and scrub wood until the walls glowed with a fierce, even heat. The dough made from flour, water, and a pinch of salt. Nothing more was rolled out on a low wooden table into thin, wide circles, draped over a rounded cushion, and then slapped onto the inner wall of the tandoor, where it stuck, puffed and baked in a matter of minutes. The warmth of flatbread pulled from the clay walls of the oven, the surface lightly charred in places, the interior still soft and steaming. The smell, a mixture of toasted wheat and wood smoke, was one of the most fundamental sensory experiences of village life. You tore it with your hands. You used it to scoop food from a communal dish. You ate it with cheese, with yogurt, with honey, if you had it, with nothing at all if you did not. It was the foundation of every meal, and the taste, faintly smoky, slightly sour from the slow fermentation of the dough, with a warmth that spread through you like a kind word, was the taste of survival itself. After the baking came the spinning. Wool from the sheep that every family kept, a small flock of 10 or 20 animals, was the raw material of the village's most important domestic industry. The fleece was sheared in spring, washed in the nearest stream, dried in the sun, and then carded, combed into loose, fluffy bundles, before being spun into yarn on a hand spindle. The spindle was a simple tool, a wooden shaft, 30 centimetres or so long, with a small waiter whirl attached near the bottom. The spinner held a mass of carded wool in one hand and the spindle in the other, twisting the shaft between her fingers to draw out and twist the fibres into a continuous thread, the rough texture of hand-spun wool sliding through calloused fingers, slightly oily from the lanolin that still clung to the fibres, warm from the friction of the twist, was a sensation that village. Women knew as well as they knew the feel of bread dough or the weight of a sleeping child on their shoulder. The yarn, once spun, was dyed, using natural pigments derived from plants, insects and minerals. Madder root produced a deep, warm red. Indigo, imported from further afield, gave a rich blue. Walnut husks yielded brown. Pomegranate rind produced a soft yellow. The dyeing process was complex, requiring mordants, chemical fixatives, often alum or iron, to bind the colour permanently to the wool, and the knowledge of which mordants to use with which dyes and in what proportions was passed down from mother to daughter over generations. It was a form of chemistry, practiced without textbooks or laboratories, and the results, the vibrant, lasting colours of Anatolian kilims and carpets, testify to the precision of the knowledge involved. The weaving itself was done on a simple ground loom, a frame of wooden beams laid flat on the floor or propped at a slight angle, with the warp threads stretched taut between them. The weaver sat on the ground before the loom, passing the weft thread back and forth with a shuttle, beating each row tight with a heavy wooden comb. The patterns, geometric shapes, stylized animals, abstract symbols, whose meanings were sometimes obscure, even to the weavers themselves, were not drawn on paper first. They were held in memory, carried in the mind's eye, and reproduced from a repertoire that each woman had learned by watching her mother and her grandmother weave the same patterns, in the same colours, on the same kind of loom, for as far back as anyone could remember. Let that rhythm carry you for a moment. A single kilim might take weeks to complete. The work was unhurried, repetitive and meditative. The rhythmic thump of the comb, the whisper of the shuttle, the gradual emergence of the pattern row by row. Women often wove together, 2 or 3 at a single loom, and the hours were filled with conversation, news, stories, songs, the passing along of herbal remedies for coughs and fevers and teething babies. These gatherings were, for many women, the closest equivalent to the men's coffee house, a social space, a place of fellowship, a refuge from the solitude of the individual household. The remedies themselves were another domain of women's knowledge. Every village had its healer, sometimes the imam's wife, sometimes an older woman known simply for her skill, who maintained a mental pharmacopoeia of plant-based treatments, drawing on Greek, Arabic and Turkic traditions. Chamomile tea for stomach complaints, a poultice of ground linseed for inflammation, thyme and honey for coughs, dried sumac berries steeped in water as a remedy for fever. The knowledge was empirical, born of centuries of observation and trial, and while it lacked the explanatory framework of modern medicine, much of it was genuinely effective. The chamomile did soothe the stomach. The thyme did ease the cough. The linseed poultice did reduce swelling. These women were not mystics. They were pragmatists, working with the materials at hand in a world where the nearest trained physician was a 3-day ride away, and might not come even if summoned. We take for granted today the ease with which we reach for a paracetamol or dial a doctor's number. In this village, in this century, a broken bone was set by a neighbour with steady hands. A difficult childbirth was attended by the village midwife, whose training consisted entirely of experience, and a fever that did not break within a week became, in the end, a matter of prayer. you would have known no different. This was the way of things, and it had been the way of things for longer than anyone could recall. And then, one afternoon, the stillness of the village is broken by a sound that everyone recognises. The creak of a laden donkey's saddle, the jingle of small bells, and the low, calling voice of a man announcing his arrival. The travelling merchant has come. He arrives perhaps once a month, sometimes less, a weather-beaten man with a donkey or two, their backs piled high with goods wrapped in canvas and rope. He comes from the direction of the nearest market town, which is itself connected by a chain of roads and caravans, and coastal ships, to the great trading cities of Izmir and Istanbul, and he brings with him things that the village cannot produce for itself. Coffee. In the 1850s, tea has not yet reached these parts, but will come later, toward the end of the century. For now, the merchant carries small cloth sacks of roasted coffee beans, dark and oily, their fragrance sharp and earthy even through the canvas wrapping. Coffee is a luxury here, expensive, carefully rationed, brewed only for guests or for the Mukhtar's evening gatherings, but its smell is known to everyone, and its arrival is an occasion. Sugar. Refined white sugar, which the village does not produce, is a luxury item here, expensive, carefully rationed, and used primarily to sweeten coffee or to make a special dessert for a wedding or a religious holiday. Most everyday sweetening is done with honey, collected from the wooden hive boxes that some families keep on the edge of the village, or with pekmez, a thick dark syrup made by boiling down grape juice until it becomes dense and intensely sweet, with a flavour that is somewhere between molasses and dried figs. Cotton cloth. The women of the village spin and weave wool, but cotton lighter, softer, better suited to the brutal summer heat is imported. The merchant's stock is modest, a few bolts of plain white cotton, a few lengths of printed calico from the factories of Izmir, or, increasingly, from Manchester. The printed cotton is a small harbinger of the global economic forces that are, gradually, but inexorably, reshaping the Ottoman countryside. The hand-woven textiles of the village cannot compete on price with the machine-made cloth of the industrial West. It will take decades for this reality to fully unfold, but the first threads of it are here, in the merchant's pack, wrapped in canvas. Alongside the coffee and the sugar, and the merchant brings something else, something that cannot be weighed or measured, but that is, in its own way, just as valuable. He brings news. He has been to the market town. He has spoken to soldiers returning from distant postings, to government officials, to other merchants, who have come from even further away. He knows, or claims to know, what is happening in Istanbul, what the latest reforms mean, whether there will be a new tax, whether the army is recruiting, whether the road to the south has been made safe. The villagers gather around him in the evening, in the Mukhtar's courtyard, and they listen. Some of the news is accurate. Some of it is rumour. Some of it is pure invention. But it is the village's primary connection to the wider world, and it is received with a mixture of curiosity, scepticism, and the practical concern of people who know that the decisions made in faraway capitals can, eventually, reach even here. The merchant stays for a night. He sleeps in the Mukhtar's guest room. Every village Mukhtar maintained a guest room, a tradition of hospitality that was both social obligation and civic duty. In the morning, he repacks his donkeys, settles his accounts, coffee and sugar and cotton exchanged for dried apricots, a small sack of walnuts, a few coins, a promise of future trade, and moves on to the next village, down the next dusty track, under the same enormous sky. And the village returns to its rhythm. The ploughing, the baking, the spinning, the prayers. The evening comes slowly to the Anatolian plateau. The sun sets behind the western hills, in a blaze of orange and copper that fades, gradually, to a pale silvery violet. The temperature drops sharply. The plateau has no moderating sea, no sheltering hills close at hand, and the heat of the day dissipates within an hour of sunset. The stars appear not gradually, as they do in a city, where light pollution dims all but the brightest, but all at once, in their thousands, filling the sky, from horizon to horizon, with a density and a brilliance that is, to modern urban eyes, almost overwhelming. The Milky Way is not a faint smudge here. It is a river of light, pouring across the dome of the sky in a great, silent arc. The village is quiet. The dogs have settled. The sheep are penned. The last lamp has been extinguished in the last house, and the only light comes from the stars and from the glow of embers in the tandir, still warm from the evening's baking. Somewhere, a nightjar calls a single, repetitive note, mechanical and oddly soothing, like a clock ticking in an empty room. And you lie on your mattress under your heavy woolen blanket, and you listen to the silence. Not true silence, there is no such thing in the countryside. The wind stirs the apricot trees. An animal shifts in its pen. The house creaks as the timber contracts in the cooling air. But it is a silence of the kind that most of us, in our modern lives, have never truly experienced. A silence without engines, without electricity, without the constant low-level hum of a technological civilization. It is the silence of the earth itself, and it is very, very deep. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed, and let that silence settle around you. There is no urgency here. There is nowhere to be. The planting is done for the day, and the earth will do its work through the night without any help from you. The bread has been baked, the fire has been banked, the children are asleep, and the sky, above the flat roof of your stone house, is so full of stars that it seems almost heavy, as though the weight of all that light were pressing gently down upon the world, holding it in place, keeping it still. This was the world of the Anatolian village, a world that had changed remarkably little in centuries, and that would, in the decades to come, change beyond all recognition. The railways would arrive. The telegraph would come. The men would be called away to wars that were not of their making, and from which many would not return. The empire itself would fall, and the village its mosque, its tekka, its stone houses, its kilim looms would find itself in a new country, under a new flag, speaking the same language in a new alphabet. But all of that was still in the future. Tonight, in the 1850s, the village sleeps. The stars turn overhead, and the earth, freshly planted, waits patiently for the rain. Now let us turn from the village and its timeless rhythms, and meet a man who believed, with a steady and sometimes costly conviction, that the Ottoman world could not afford to stay the same. Segment 6. Biography, Event Narrative 2. The Reforming Vision of Sultan Mahmud II. Now let us meet a man who was, in almost every respect, the opposite of Suleiman the Magnificent, not in ambition, not in intelligence, but in circumstance. Where Suleiman inherited a thriving empire at the height of its power, the man we are about to follow inherited a crumbling one. Where Suleiman was groomed for rule in the sunlit provinces of Anatolia, this man spent his formative years in a locked room, waiting to be killed. His name was Mahmud. He would become Sultan Mahmud II, and his story begins not with a coronation or a conquest, but with a door that closed behind him and did not open again for years. The Kafes. The word means cage in Turkish, and it was not a metaphor. The Kafes was a suite of rooms within the innermost recesses of the Topkapı palace, comfortable enough by the standards of imprisonment, but sealed. The windows looked onto a small interior garden, but the doors were guarded. The visitors were controlled, and the princes confined within had no meaningful contact with the outside world, except through their attendants and the occasional, carefully managed audience with the reigning sultan. The Kafes had been instituted in the early 17th century as a solution to a grim and recurring problem: succession. The Ottomans had no fixed rule of primogeniture. Any son of the sultan could, in theory, claim the throne, and for centuries this had meant that each new sultan's first act was often the removal of his brothers. a practice that was, in time, deemed unsustainable. The kafes was the alternative. Instead of killing the princes, confine them. Keep them alive in case they are needed, but keep them isolated. Away from the army, away from the court, away from anyone who might use them as a rallying point for rebellion. The result, in human terms, was a peculiar form of living suspension. Princes entered the cafes as children or young men, and some of them remained there for decades. They were fed, clothed, and provided with attendants the dynasty had to continue, after all. But they were denied education in statecraft, denied military training, denied contact with the political world. They might one day be called upon to govern. Some of them emerged so ill-prepared that their reigns were brief and troubled. The kafes preserved the bloodline. It did not preserve the capacity to rule. Settle a little deeper into the quiet of your own evening, and let us enter that stillness, not as prisoners, but as listeners, tracing the story of one young man who waited behind those doors and emerged at last into the light. Mahmud entered this world as a boy. Born in 1785, the son of Sultan Abdul Hamid I, he grew up in the shadow of the kafes, aware from an early age of the fate that had befallen other princes of his line, including his kinsman Selim, who had himself endured those same rooms before ascending the throne in 1789. The rooms were not bare cells, they had tiled walls in faded blues and greens, cushioned divans, whose silk coverings had grown thin with use, small windows that let in a pale filtered light, but they were, in every meaningful sense, a prison. The stale, cloistered air hung heavy, with beeswax from the candles that burned constantly in the windowless inner chambers, and with the faint, lingering scent of sandalwood incense that could not quite mask the stuffiness of rooms that were never properly aired. The sound was the worst of it, or rather, the absence of sound. A silence that was not peaceful, but tense, watchful. The silence of people who knew that the next footstep in the corridor might bring news of a change in fortune, from which there would be no return. Mahmud watched. He listened. He waited. And, in his own quiet way, he learned. His kinsman Selim III became Sultan in 1789, the same year, as it happened, that revolution swept through France, and immediately embarked on a program of military reform. The Nizam-i-Jadid, the new order, aimed to create a modern European-style army to supplement and eventually replace the increasingly unreliable Janissaries. Selim's reforms were intelligent, far-sighted and, as it turned out, premature. The Janissaries resisted. The ulema, the religious establishment, objected to what they saw as an imitation of foreign ways. The court conservatives plotted. In 1807, a Janissary revolt swept through Istanbul, and Selim was deposed. He was returned to confinement, the same rooms he had once left behind. An pliant relative, Mustafa IV, was placed on the throne in his stead. And then, in 1808, things grew worse. A loyalist pasha named Alemdar Mustafa marched on Istanbul with his provincial army, determined to restore Selim to power. But Mustafa IV, knowing that a living Selim was a threat to his own position, gave the order for his predecessor to be removed. Selim did not survive the day. It happened behind sealed doors, out of sight, and with a swiftness that left no room for intervention. Mahmud, in the adjacent chambers, became aware of the disturbance. He understood, in the way that a person, confined to small rooms, learns to read every sound, that the world beyond his walls had shifted. And he understood too that his own life now hung upon whatever happened next. What followed in the next few minutes is the subject of competing accounts, none of them entirely reliable. What is clear is that Mahmud survived by the intervention of loyal servants, by the chaos of the moment, by what can only be called a very narrow margin. Alemdar Mustafa's forces secured the palace, deposed Mustafa IV, and Mahmud, the last surviving prince of the Ottoman line, was brought out into the daylight and placed on the throne. He was 23 years old. He had spent most of his conscious life behind locked doors, and he was now the Sultan of an empire that was coming apart at the seams. Consider that for a moment. Tonight, lying safely in the warmth of your own room, consider the weight of that inheritance. Not the political crises alone, not the military setbacks, and the provincial revolts that awaited the new Sultan, but the personal weight. The years of confinement, the knowledge that his survival was an accident of minutes, the muffled sounds through a wall that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Mahmud bore all of this, and it shapes everything he did. The discipline, the cold and methodical determination that would later define his reign. These were qualities forged in confinement, in the stillness, in the waiting, in the understanding that power, once seized, must never be held loosely. And so the world changed, not all at once, but with the slow, deliberate turning of a man who had learned, above all else, that haste was a luxury he could not afford. But Mahmud had learned, in those long and silent years, a quality that Suleiman had lacked the willingness to wait. He understood that transformation could not be imposed by decree alone. It required preparation, it required allies, and above all, it required the removal of the one force that had blocked every previous attempt at modernization, the Janissaries. The Janissary Corps, by the early 19th century, bore almost no resemblance to the disciplined, fighting force that had once been feared across 3 continents. Over the centuries, the Corps had become a hereditary guild membership was passed from father to son. The rigorous training had lapsed, and the Janissaries had diversified into trade, shopkeeping, and the collection of protection money from the neighbourhoods in which they were garrisoned. They were, in effect, a heavily armed interest group embedded in the heart of the capital, and they had demonstrated, repeatedly, that they were willing to use force to protect their privileges. They had toppled sultans, they had undone reformers, and they regarded any attempt to create a modern military force as a direct threat to their status and their livelihood. Mahmud understood all of this, and so, for 18 years from his accession in 1808 to the summer of 1826, he moved quietly, methodically, and with a discipline that never once betrayed his intentions. He cultivated allies among the religious establishment, securing fatwas, formal legal opinions from the highest Islamic authorities, that supported the principle of military modernization. He built a network of loyal artillery units, trained in modern European techniques, and equipped with modern cannon, and he stationed them at key points within reach of Istanbul. He placed his own men in critical positions throughout the government and the military hierarchy. He watched. He waited. And when the moment came, he was ready. Let yourself breathe slowly for a moment and picture the city of Istanbul in the summer of 1826. The air is warm and thick, carrying the scent of dust, and overripe figs from the market stalls below the palace walls. The Bosphorus glimmers in the distance, and within the council chambers a decision has been made. Mahmud issued a decree establishing a new, modern infantry force, the Askinci, to be recruited from among the Janissaries themselves. The decree was deliberately provocative. Mahmud knew, as surely as he knew anything, that the Janissaries would revolt. He was counting on it. And revolt they did. On the 15th of June, the Janissaries overturned their great copper soup kettles in the barracks square, the traditional Ottoman signal of mutiny, a gesture as old as the Corps itself, and took to the streets. But this time, the streets were not undefended. Mahmud had prepared. The sacred banner of the Prophet, a relic of enormous symbolic power, kept in the Topkapı palace and brought out only in moments of supreme crisis, was unfurled at the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, rallying the civilian population and the loyal troops to the Sultan's cause. What followed was brief. The modern artillery spoke, and the old barracks fell quiet. The sound echoed once across the rooftops and then faded, as sounds do, into the wide and indifferent sky. The Corps was dissolved by imperial decree. The survivors were dispersed, exiled, or detained. The kettles, those great copper symbols of Janissary identity, around which generations of soldiers had gathered for their communal meals, and which had served as the ritual instruments of revolt, were confiscated, and they were not seen again. The Ottomans called it the Vaka-i Hayriye, the auspicious incident. The name was, of course, a political choice, crafted to frame the dissolution of the Janissaries as a moment of renewal rather than of rupture. And in a sense, it was a renewal. But the cost was not small. The reverberations were felt across the empire for years, and the question of whether the scale of the means was warranted by the necessity of the end is one that has never been settled with certainty. What is beyond dispute is that the single greatest obstacle to Ottoman modernization had been removed, and Mahmud, the prince who had survived his confinement by a margin of minutes, was now free to reshape the empire according to his own vision. The days turned, the smoke thinned on the wind, and the work of building something new began in earnest. The changes that followed came rapidly, and they touched every visible surface of Ottoman public life. The most immediately noticeable was sartorial. In 1829, Mahmud issued a decree abolishing the turban, that most iconic of Ottoman headgear, for all government officials and military personnel, and replacing it with the fez, a brimless, flat-topped felt cap of North African origin, dyed a distinctive crimson. The decree was, on the surface, a matter of fashion. In reality, it was a matter of politics. The turban was not merely a hat, it was a text. Its size, its shape, its colour, the manner in which it was wound, all of these communicated information about the wearer's rank, profession, religious affiliation, and community. To abolish the turban was to abolish a visual language that had organised Ottoman society for centuries. To replace it with a single uniform headpiece the same for all, regardless of background, was to assert a new and radical principle, that the outward distinctions between the empire's subjects could and should be dissolved. The unfamiliar stiffness of a new fez pressed onto a freshly shorn head for the decree also required that the hair beneath the fez be cut short, in the European fashion, was a sensation that thousands of Ottoman men experienced, with varying degrees of willingness and resentment in the months that followed. The felt was warm against the scalp, slightly rough, and carried the faint chemical smell of the dye vats in which it had been steeped. For some, among the younger officials and the Western-educated intelligentsia, it was a welcome emblem of progress. For others, among the conservative religious classes and the provincial population, it was an affront, a visible, wearable betrayal of tradition. The irony, of course, is that the fez itself would eventually become so thoroughly identified with Ottoman identity that, when the Turkish Republic abolished it in 1925 and replaced it with the European style, brimmed hat, the cycle of resistance and indignation repeated itself almost precisely. Symbols, it seems, are easier to impose than to control. Imagine yourself there, just for a moment, standing in the courtyard of a government office in Istanbul, sometime in the early 1830s. The officials filing past you are dressed in a manner that would have been unrecognisable to their grandfathers. Dark frock coats in the European cut, narrow trousers, polished boots, and, atop every head, the crimson fez with its black silk tassel, swaying gently as they walk. The air smells of fresh ink and the pomade that the younger clerks have taken to applying to their hair in imitation of the French fashion. Through an open window, you can hear the scratch of steel nib pens on paper. A new sound, this, replacing the softer whisper of the reed calame that had served Ottoman scribes for centuries. The old world is still here, in the architecture, in the minarets, visible above the rooftops, in the distant sound of the ezan, but it is being overlaid, slowly and deliberately, with something new. But Mahmud's vision of transformation extended far beyond what men wore on their heads. He created a new European-style army, initially trained by Prussian officers, equipped with modern firearms, organised along Western lines of command. An imperial postal service came into being, connecting the major cities of the empire for the first time, with regular, scheduled deliveries. Letters that once took weeks now arriving in days. Alongside it appeared the Takvim-i Vekai, the Calendar of Events, the first official Ottoman newspaper, published in both Ottoman Turkish and French from 1831 onwards, serving as the government's organ for disseminating decrees, news, and, inevitably, a carefully shaped version of events. New schools followed military academies, medical colleges, engineering institutes designed to produce the educated professionals that the modernising state required. And young Ottoman men were sent to study in Paris, London and Vienna, where they learned engineering, medicine and military science, and where they also encountered in lecture halls, in bookshops, in the salons and coffee houses of European capitals, the political ideas of the Enlightenment, of liberalism, of constitutionalism, ideas that they would carry home, and that would, in time, reshape the empire far more profoundly than any fez or telegraph line. And though Mahmud himself did not live to witness it, the seeds of connection he had planted would bear fruit remarkably soon. The metallic click-click of an early telegraph machine in a lamp-lit government office. This was a sound that would become familiar in Ottoman cities. Barely 16 years after his death, the first Ottoman telegraph line was laid in 1855, and within 2 decades, the empire possessed one of the most extensive telegraph networks in the world, linking Istanbul to its distant provinces and permitting, for the first time, the near-instantaneous transmission of orders, reports, and intelligence across thousands of kilometres. The implications were profound. A provincial governor who had once operated with considerable autonomy, because directives from the capital took weeks to arrive by courier, and by the time they did, circumstances had shifted beyond recognition, now found himself answerable in something close to real time. The telegraph did not merely transmit messages, it centralised power, it compressed distance, and it made the Sultan, any Sultan, sitting in his study, with the apparatus clicking in the adjoining room, more immediately present in the lives of his subjects than any ruler had been before. Today, of course, we take such instant communication so thoroughly for granted that it requires a conscious effort to recall a world in which a message to a distant city was measured not in seconds, but in weeks. Close your eyes and picture this, if you are still awake. The rustle of a French-language newspaper unfolded on the marble tabletop of a newly opened Istanbul cafe. This too was a texture of the new world Mahmud had set in motion. Alongside the traditional coffee houses with their storytellers and their backgammon boards, a different sort of establishment was appearing, the European-style cafe, serving coffee its familiar bitterness now tempered, in the European fashion, with a measure of warm milk. In handled cups rather than the traditional finjan, and offering French and Italian periodicals, alongside plates of small crumbling biscuits dusted with sugar. These cafes attracted a clientele of young Western-educated Ottoman intellectuals who discussed politics and philosophy in a fluid mixture of Turkish, French and Persian. These gathering places were nurseries of a new Ottoman identity, modern, cosmopolitan, restless, suspended between the inheritance of the past and the uncertain demands of the future. And life, as it always does, found its way forward, through the discomfort of new clothes, through the unfamiliar sounds of new machines, through the slow and not always willing adjustment to a world that was being remade from above. Mahmud's programme has often been compared to that of Peter, the Great in Russia, and the comparison has merit, up to a point. Both men sought to modernise traditional empires through concentrated, top-down action. Both confronted fierce resistance from entrenched conservative elites. Both imposed new dress codes, new institutions, and new cultural norms by the force of sovereign will. But there is a difference worth noting. Peter ruled an empire that was, for all its difficulties, militarily formidable and geographically secure. Mahmud did not. The Ottoman Empire in the 1830s was besieged on multiple fronts, by Greek independence, by Egyptian rebellion under Mehmed Ali, by Russian territorial expansion, by the gradual, relentless erosion of its European provinces. Mahmud's changes were not aspirational luxuries. They were acts of necessity, undertaken by a man who understood that without modernization, the empire he had inherited at such personal cost would cease to exist. It was a tension that Mahmud grasped, at least in part, that the tools he needed to save the empire were borrowed from the very civilization that threatened to overwhelm it. Western military techniques, Western administrative methods, Western dress, Western education, all of these were adopted not out of admiration for the West, or not solely out of admiration, but out of the cold calculation that the alternative was dissolution. The tension would outlast Mahmud. It would shadow the late Ottoman Empire, and it would shadow the successor states that emerged from its collapse. It remains, in many parts of the world, unresolved. But let us end, as we began, with the man himself. Mahmud was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a figure of considerable personal presence, not physically imposing, but possessed of a directness and an energy that were unusual among the later Ottoman sultans. Unlike the remote, sequestered rulers of earlier centuries, who communicated with the world, primarily through intermediaries, and who were seldom glimpsed outside the palace walls, Mahmud broke with tradition in ways that genuinely startled his contemporaries. He rode through the streets of Istanbul on horseback, accompanied by a modest retinue, stopping to inspect government offices, visiting military installations, appearing at public events in his fez and his dark frock coat. He was not performing populism. He was asserting a new model of sovereignty, visible, practical, engaged with the machinery of governance. Rather than hidden behind the latticed screens of Topkapı, his personal habits were modest by the standards of the Ottoman court. He ate simply plain rice, grilled meat, bread still warm from the oven, accompanied by water or a mild sherbet of lemon and rose water. He had little taste for the elaborate feasts that had characterized his predecessors' tables. He was a skilled calligrapher. His tugra, the intricate monogram that served as the Sultan's official signature on imperial documents, is regarded as one of the finest in the Ottoman tradition, its flowing curves executed with a steadiness of hand that suggests long practice and genuine devotion to the art. He was a patron of music, supporting both the classical Ottoman court tradition and the introduction of Western musical forms, including the establishment of a military band trained in European brass and percussion. Close your eyes and picture him. If you will, a man of middle years, slight of build, dressed in the dark coat and crimson fez that he himself had made obligatory, seated at a low desk in a room overlooking the Bosphorus, the late afternoon light slanting through the window and catching the gold ink of a tura he has just completed. The pen a fine reed kalam, not the European steel nib, that his clerks now use, rests in his fingers with the easy familiarity of long habit. The room smells of ink and paper, and the faint, briny scent of the sea carried through the open casement. For a moment, in this small, private act of craftsmanship, the Sultan is not a reformer or a revolutionary. He is a man who has spent his life doing difficult things, and who finds, in the slow discipline of beautiful writing, a form of peace. He was also, it must be acknowledged, a man capable of unflinching resolve. The dissolution of the Janissaries was not an act of restrained negotiation. It was a calculated use of overwhelming force, prepared over 18 years and executed with a precision that left no room for compromise. Mahmud understood power as only someone who had nearly been destroyed by it could understand it. Those who emerge from long confinement do not emerge as gentle men. They emerge as survivors, and survivors, by necessity, carry with them a hardness that gentler lives do not require. Mahmud died on the 1st of July 1839 at the age of 53. The cause was most likely tuberculosis, though the records are not definitive. He died not in Topkapı, which he had largely abandoned in favour of newer, European-style palaces along the Bosphorus, but in one of those waterside residences with a view, one imagines, of the strait he had spent his life trying to defend. He was buried in a turba near the Divan Yolu, the ancient main road of Istanbul, where his tomb can still be visited today. A modest, elegant structure, shaded by plane trees, its interior cool and dim, and faintly scented with the rose water that attendants still sprinkle upon the sarcophagus. He died some 4 months before the proclamation of the Gulhane Edict, the Hatti Sheriff of Gulhane, which was read aloud on the 3rd of November 1839, and which his ministers had drafted under his guidance. It inaugurated the Tanzimat, the great programme of legal, educational, and administrative renewal that would reshape the empire over the next 4 decades. Mahmud did not live to hear it read, but it was, in every meaningful sense, his work, the culmination of a vision that had taken shape in the silence of those sealed rooms, been forged in the upheaval of the auspicious incident, and carried forward by a man who believed, with all the conviction and all the flaws of a genuine revolutionary, that the only way to preserve the empire was to transform it utterly. He is remembered, still, as both destroyer and builder, the man who silenced the Janissary kettles and abolished the turban, the man who opened new schools and sent young men to Paris, the man who walked through the streets of Istanbul in his fez and his frock coat, looking, to those who watched him pass, like a figure who belonged to 2 ages at once, one hand reaching back toward the Ottoman past, the other extended toward a future that he could sense but could not quite see. Whether the future he envisioned was the one that ultimately arrived is another question, a quieter question, and one that we shall return to, gently, in the chapters that remain. Interlude. C. A moment of stillness in a courtyard garden. Let us rest here for a little while. We have covered a great deal of ground in this second half of our journey. The unhurried rhythms of a village on the Anatolian plateau. The fierce, complicated life of a sultan who tried to remake the world from the inside out. It has been a story of change, of old orders falling and new ones rising, of turbans giving way to fezzes, of copper, kettles silenced, and telegraph wires strung across a continent. And change, even when recounted at a gentle pace, can be tiring to hold in the mind. So let us pause. Imagine that you are sitting in a courtyard garden, one of those small enclosed spaces that the Ottomans designed with such care for reflection and rest. The walls around you are high, covered in climbing jasmine, whose white flowers release a soft, sweet fragrance into the evening air. Beneath you, a stone bench holds the lingering warmth of the day's sun, solid and smooth against your palms. At the centre of the courtyard, a small stone fountain murmurs to itself, a steady, unhurried trickle of water into a shallow basin, the sound as regular and as calming as a heartbeat. The sky above is deepening from pale blue to violet. A blackbird offers a few clear notes from somewhere atop the wall, and then falls silent. You have come a long way tonight, from the streets of 16th-century Istanbul, through the arc of a golden age, Sultan, through the mysteries of architecture and hidden manuscripts behind the walls of the palace, and then far out into the villages and the centuries that followed. The empire has changed around you as you listen, and there is still a little further to go, but not yet. For now, breathe slowly in and gently out. Let the jasmine settle around you. Let the fountain do the only thing it knows how to do. When you are ready, we will continue into the empire's quieter riddles, its forgotten communities, its lost music, and then, at last, into its long and gentle echo. Segment 7. Mystery Archaeology Culture Deep Dive 2. Lost Traditions, Forgotten Communities, and Ottoman Riddles. We have arrived at the gentler part of our journey now, the part where the stories become smaller, stranger, and, in their own way, more affecting than anything that sultans or grand viziers could provide. We are leaving the corridors of power behind and entering the corridors of memory, the places where things were hidden, things were forgotten, and things were lost. This part of our story is about riddles, not the kind with answers, but the kind that linger. The Ottoman Empire lasted for 6 centuries and governed tens of millions of people. and most of those people left no written record of their lives. No diaries, no memoirs, no letters that survived. They lived, they worked, they loved, and then they were gone, leaving behind only fragments, a broken cup, a clay pipe, a song half remembered, a chapel hidden behind a false wall. These fragments are what we are going to spend some time with now, gently, without rushing toward conclusions. Let us begin in the mountains. The Pontic Alps run along the Black Sea coast of northeastern Turkey, a range of steep, green, mist-shrouded mountains that rise sharply from the coastline and are cut by deep valleys, thick with chestnut and rhododendron forest. It is a landscape of extraordinary beauty and considerable isolation. The villages here, tucked into narrow valleys or perched on high ridges, were for centuries among the most remote communities in the Ottoman Empire. The roads were poor, the terrain was difficult, the central government was far away, and in this isolation, something remarkable persisted. In several of these mountain communities, populations that have been formally registered as Muslim, that attended the mosque, that bore Muslim names, that paid their taxes, and fulfilled their civic obligations as Muslims, were, in private, practicing Christianity. The phenomenon is known as crypto-Christianity, and its existence in the Pontic region has been documented and debated for more than a century. The evidence is fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, but it is persistent. Travellers in the 19th century reported encountering communities where families maintained two sets of names, a Muslim name for public use and a Christian name for use within the home. Figures who functioned as priests were said to visit in secret, conducting baptisms and marriages. According to the Greek Orthodox Rite, hidden chapels, small unadorned rooms behind false walls, or in the cellars of houses have been reported, though very few have been conclusively verified by modern archaeology. And there were songs coded, elusive, sung in the Pontic Greek dialect that contained references to Christian saints, to the liturgy, to the hope of a return to open worship that never, in most cases, came. Imagine the scene, just for a moment. A stone house in a mountain village, the shutters drawn tight, the door bolted, the only light a single tallow candle guttering in a draught. A family gathers parents, children, an elderly grandparent who remembers more of the old rituals than anyone else alive. And in that small, flickering circle of light, they perform a rite that they cannot acknowledge in the morning, a prayer in Greek, a sign of the cross made quickly and without sound, a hymn sung so softly that it barely rises above the level of breathing. The candle smells of animal fat and beeswax. The stone walls are cold and slightly damp to the touch, and outside the village is still, knowing nothing, or more accurately, choosing to know nothing. How did this happen? The most commonly offered explanation is that these communities converted to Islam, or were recorded as having converted, during periods of particular pressure. In the 17th or 18th centuries, when economic incentives, social expectations, or anxiety about conscription made conversion the pragmatic choice. But the conversion was, in many cases, outward only. The inner life, the prayers, the saints, the rituals continued, passed from parent to child in whispers and in song. It is worth noting that this phenomenon was not unique to the Pontic coast. Crypto-religious communities existed in many parts of the Ottoman world. In Salonika, the Donme descendants of followers of Sabbatai Zevi, the 17th century Jewish messianic figure who converted to Islam in 1666, maintained their own form of double identity for centuries, blending Jewish and Islamic observance in private. In parts of the Balkans, similar patterns of dual religious identity have been documented among communities that inhabited the boundary between Christianity and Islam. The scholarly discussion is ongoing and sensitive. The truth almost certainly varied from village to village, family to family, generation to generation. What we can say is that these communities lived in a space of deep ambiguity between two faiths, two names, two identities, two versions of themselves. And when in the early 20th century, the the population exchanges between Greece and Turkey, uprooted them from the mountains where they had lived for centuries. Many of them found that they belonged fully to neither world. In Greece, they were regarded with suspicion by their fellow Orthodox Christians. These were people who bore Muslim names, who spoke Turkish, as well as Greek, whose customs were a blend of both traditions. In Turkey, they were remembered, if at all, as Muslims who had departed. The double identity that had sustained them for generations became, in the end, a double exile. It is a soft story, not a dramatic one, but it is, in its way, one of the most human stories. The Ottoman Empire produced a story about what people do, deep inside themselves, when the world demands that they be something other than what they are. And life, as it always does, carried on in two languages, under two names, in two directions at once. Let us shift our gaze now from the hidden to the public, from prayers whispered behind locked doors to a place that was, in some ways, the most open space in the entire Ottoman world. Let your breathing settle, and let us return, gently, to the coffee house. We visited a coffee house briefly in our first segment, as part of a day in 16th-century Istanbul, but we treated it then as background, a pleasant detail in the texture of daily life. Now, let us look at it differently. Let us look at it as an institution, one that the Ottoman authorities regarded at various times with considerable unease, and one that has been called the first true public sphere in the Islamic world. Coffee itself entered the Ottoman world in the early 16th century, travelling northward from Yemen, where Sufi mystics had discovered that the brewed drink helped them remain wakeful during long nights of prayer and contemplation. It reached Cairo, then Damascus, and by the middle of the century, the first coffee houses had opened in Istanbul. Wherever coffee went, it brought with it a new kind of social space, a place where men gathered not to pray, not to trade, not to eat a meal, but to sit, to drink, and to talk. This may sound unremarkable to our ears. It was not. In Ottoman society, the established public spaces were all, in some sense, functional. The mosque was for worship, the bazaar was for commerce, the hammam was for bathing. The coffee house was the first space whose primary purpose was conversation, and conversation, as every government in history has eventually discovered, is not easily controlled. The bitter cardamom-laced sip of Ottoman coffee from a finjan no larger than an egg. The taste is sharp, earthy, thick with fine sediment, and startlingly strong. You hold the tiny cup between thumb and forefinger, the porcelain warm against your skin, and you drink slowly, because there is very little to drink, and because the act of drinking is, in the coffee house, secondary to the act of being present. The air around you is layered with the smoke of tobacco. Pipes, long-stemmed chibuks are everywhere, and with the low, continuous hum of dozens of simultaneous conversations, the smoky tang of roasting chestnuts drifts through the open door from a street vendor just outside. The wooden floorboards creak beneath the weight of a waiter, carrying a copper tray crowded with cups, and in the corner, on a slightly raised platform, a performance is taking place. One that made the coffee house not only a social space, but an entertainment venue of a kind that the Ottoman world had not previously known. Shadow puppet theatre, Karagoz. The Karagoz tradition, named after its central character, a quick-witted, sharp-tongued everyman, paired with his more refined, but equally comic companion Hatsivat, was performed using flat, jointed leather puppets, held behind a translucent screen and illuminated from behind by a candle or an oil lamp. The figures cast vivid, colourful shadows on the screen, reds and greens, and yellows, their outlines sharp and slightly trembling in the unsteady light. And the puppeteer, the Hayali, the Imaginist, voiced all the characters, improvised jokes, satirised public figures, and, when the mood took him, veered into commentary on politics, religion, and social mores that would have been impermissible in any other setting. The coffee house was, in this sense, a space of relative freedom, a place where things could be said, obliquely, through the mouths of leather puppets that could not be said directly in the street or the court. The authorities knew this, and they were uneasy. At various points in Ottoman history, coffee houses were shut down, sometimes because of concerns about sedition, sometimes because of moral objections to the mingling of social classes, sometimes because the ulama disapproved of the beverage itself, arguing that the stimulating effects of coffee made it analogous to intoxicants and therefore forbidden. The bans never lasted. The coffee houses always reopened. The demand was too great, the social function too deeply woven into daily life, and the tax revenue too valuable to suppress for long. Picture yourself, if you will, rising from the low wooden bench in one of those old coffee houses, stepping out into the evening street, the taste of coffee still on your tongue, the murmur of conversation fading behind you. The Ottoman coffee house has sometimes been compared to the European coffee houses of the 17th and 18th centuries, London's Lloyd's, the Parisian cafes of the philosophes. The parallel is suggestive but limited. The Ottoman coffee house did not produce a political revolution, but it did produce a space in which public opinion, that amorphous, ungovernable force, could form, circulate, and, on occasion, make itself felt. And now, centuries later, the old coffee houses are largely gone. The Karagöz puppets hang in museum cases, the chibuks have been replaced by cigarettes, and the cigarettes, in many places, by nothing at all. But the Turkish coffee house, a lineal descendant, even if the setting has changed, endures. And the act of sitting with a small cup of very strong coffee, talking with a friend or a stranger, watching the world pass by through a window, that act, which the Ottomans did not invent but certainly perfected, is still, in its essentials, alive. The world keeps more than we think, even when it seems to have forgotten. But some things are preserved not in memory, but in the ground. And it is to the ground, literally, to the earth, that we now turn. Settle a little deeper into the stillness of this hour, and let us think about what lies beneath our feet. Archaeology, in the popular imagination, tends to be associated with dramatic discoveries. Tombs, temples, golden masks, cities lost beneath jungle canopy. Ottoman archaeology is not, for the most part, like that. It is unhurried, more modest in its materials, and, in its own patient way, more revealing of ordinary life than any palace chronicle could hope to be. In recent decades, archaeologists working on Ottoman period sites across the former empire, in Turkey, Greece, Israel, the Balkans, and North Africa, have been paying increasing attention to a category of evidence that earlier generations of scholars tended to overlook. Refuse, middens, rubbish pits, the accumulated detritus of daily life that was dumped, buried, and forgotten, and that has survived, in pieces, for 2 or 3 or 400 years. The soft clink of a clay pipe fragment, brushed clean by an archaeologist's bristle. This is the characteristic sound of Ottoman everyday archaeology. The fragment is small, 3 centimetres. Long, the broken stem of a tobacco pipe, made of fine white clay, with a faintly incised geometric pattern near where the bowl once was. It was manufactured, probably, in one of the 4 pipe-making centres of the Balkans or Western Anatolia workshops that produced these fragile, disposable objects by the tens of thousands. It was smoked, broken and discarded, tossed into a pit along with animal bones, shards of broken pottery, glass beads, and the shells of mussels and walnuts. And there it lay, undisturbed, until a trowel turned it up, and a gloved hand lifted it into the light. What does it tell us? On its own, not a great deal, but multiply it by thousands, by the tens of thousands of pipe fragments, recovered from Ottoman-era sites across 3 continents, and patterns begin to emerge. The shape of the pipe bowl changed over time, becoming gradually larger as tobacco consumption increased. The clay came from identifiable sources, allowing archaeologists to trace networks of manufacture and trade. The decorative patterns varied by region, suggesting local tastes and local workshops, and the sheer ubiquity of pipe fragments tells us that the Ottomans smoked widely, enthusiastically, and across every boundary of class, gender, and religion. Tobacco, introduced from the Americas in the late 16th century, spread through the empire with remarkable speed, and by the 17th century, smoking was as embedded in Ottoman social life as coffee drinking. The practice was so widespread that attempts to ban it, and there were several, backed by the full authority of the Sultan, proved as futile as the earlier attempts to ban coffee. But the pipes are only one thread in the fabric. The animal bones found in refuse pits tell us about diet, what people ate, how they prepared it, whether they favoured lamb or goat or beef, whether they consumed fish, whether they kept poultry. The ceramics tell us about commerce. A shard of Chinese porcelain, recovered from a modest household in Palestine, speaks of trade networks that linked the humblest corners of the empire to the kilns of distant Jingdezhen. The glass bracelets, small, coloured rings of glass, found in enormous quantities on Ottoman sites across Anatolia and the Balkans, their surfaces catching the light in shades of blue and green and amber, tell us about personal adornment, about the small, everyday acts of beauty that people performed even in lives of considerable hardship. Tonight, lying comfortably where you are, you might glance around your room and notice the objects of your own daily life. A cup, a book, a garment draped over a chair. In 300 years, if any of these survived, they would tell an archaeologist something about how you lived, what you consumed, what you valued, what you discarded without a second thought. The people of the Ottoman Empire are no different. They did not intend to leave us messages in their rubbish, but they did, all the same, messages written in broken clay and gnawed bone and coloured glass. Messages that say, softly and unmistakably, "We were here. This is how we lived." Their world left its traces, and those traces, however small, remain. Let us end this segment with something that cannot be held in the hand at all, something that exists only in the air, only in the moment of its making, and that, once it stops, is gone. Ottoman music, the Ottoman classical music tradition, the tradition of the court, of the Sufi lodge, of the educated urban elite, was one of the most sophisticated musical systems in the world. It was built on the makam, a framework of melodic modes that governed not only the notes to be played, but the manner in which those notes were approached, ornamented, and connected to one another. There were dozens of recognised makams, each with its own character, its own emotional shading, its own set of conventions, about which tones could serve as resting points, which could be lingered upon, and which must be passed through like stepping stones in a gentle stream. If you are accustomed to Western music, to its major and minor scales, to the 12, even semitones that govern the piano, then the makam system will sound, at first, unfamiliar. The intervals are different. Some of the notes fall between the keys of a piano. They are not sharp, not flat, but a place in between, a place for which Western notation has no adequate symbol. The melodies move in ways that do not resolve as a Western ear expects. They circle, they ornament, they return to the same phrase again and again, with slight, almost imperceptible variations, and the effect for a listener who surrenders to it is deeply, almost physically calming. It is music designed not to excite, but to deepen, not to entertain, but to carry you elsewhere. And so the music carried the listener onward, as gently, and as surely as a current carries a leaf. The instruments of Ottoman classical music were few, but exquisite in their capacity for nuance. The ney, a simple end-blown reed flute, with no keys, no mechanisms, just a hollow length of cane, and the breath of the player, was the most revered, its haunting breathy tones spiralling upward into silence. There is no sound quite like it in any other musical tradition. It is airy but warm. It is plain but endlessly capable of shade and variation. The Sufis considered the ney to be the instrument closest to the human voice, and they heard in its sound the longing of the soul for reunion with the divine, the cry of the reed that has been cut from the reed bed. as Rumi evoked in the opening lines of the Masnavi, the great mystical poem, often rendered into English as "Listen to the reed," how it tells a tale, complaining of separations. Alongside the ney, the tanbur, a long-necked fretted lute plucked with a plectrum, fashioned from a thin chip of tortoiseshell, provided the melodic architecture, its metallic, shimmering tone sustaining the modal framework, within which the other instruments could move. The kudum, a pair of small hemispherical drums struck with light wooden sticks, marked the rhythmic cycle with a soft, dry, almost whispering pulse that seemed less to impose rhythm than to reveal it, the way a breeze reveals the current of a river by ruffling its surface. And vocal music was central to the tradition. The ghazal, a freely improvised vocal piece following the contours of a chosen makam, was considered the highest form of Ottoman musical art, and the greatest singers were celebrated figures whose performances could move entire rooms to tears. Close your eyes now, if they are not already closed, and imagine the sound. A room not large, the upper chamber of a wealthy merchant's house overlooking the Bosphorus. The windows open to the night air, the candles low. 3 musicians sit on cushions. The ney player, cross-legged, the instrument held at a slight angle, his breath slow and controlled. The tambur player, the long neck of the instrument resting against his shoulder, his right hand moving in small, precise strokes. And the kudum player, his sticks barely touching the drum skins, producing a sound so soft that it is more felt than heard. And then a voice enters low, flexible, unhurried, following the makam upward through intervals that seem, to an unaccustomed ear, to bend and float in ways that defy the neat geometry of Western scales. The air in the room smells of the Bosphorus salt and algae, and the faintly mineral tang of deep water, and of the incense that has been burning on a small brass tray in the corner. The candlelight flickers on the faces of the listeners, who sit in silence, their eyes half closed, following the music, not with their minds, but with something deeper, closer to the pulse. But here is the thing that makes this story both beautiful and melancholy. For centuries, this entire tradition was transmitted without notation. A student learned by sitting with a master, listening, repeating, memorizing hour after hour, week after week, until the contours of each makam were not merely known, but inhabited, embedded in the muscles of the fingers, in the memory of the breath. The knowledge was personal, intimate, and profoundly fragile. If a master died without having fully transmitted his repertoire, that particular thread of the tradition was severed, not in theory, but in fact. In the early 19th century, an Armenian musician named Hamparsum Limonsian, encouraged by Sultan Selim III, developed a notation system, the Hamparsum notation, that could, for the first time, represent the microtonal intervals and ornamental conventions of Ottoman music on paper. The system was adopted by the court and by music schools, and it preserved a portion of the repertoire that might otherwise have vanished entirely. But a notation system, however ingenious, captures only the architecture of a performance, the notes, the rhythms, the formal structure, the life of the music, the ornaments, the timing, the particular quality of breath that a ney player uses to shade a note from bright to shadowed, remains in the hands and lungs and memory of the living performer. And when, in the 1920s and 1930s, the new Turkish Republic turned decisively away from Ottoman cultural forms and embraced Western models, when the conservatories were reorganized along European lines, when Western staff notation replaced Hamparsum, when state radio broadcasts favored Western-style orchestras over traditional ensembles, much of the Ottoman musical tradition came perilously close to disappearing. The old masters grew elderly. Their students were fewer with each passing year. The makams that had once been the shared musical language of an empire became, in the space of a single generation, the specialized knowledge of a dwindling circle of performers and scholars. The tradition did not die. It survived in the Sufi lodges that continued to operate with discretion, in the private homes of musicians who refused to abandon what they had learned, in the recordings that were made, sometimes only just in time, of elderly masters, performing pieces that no one else alive could play. In recent decades, there has been a renewal, a growing interest in Turkey and beyond in the makam system in the ney and the tambur in the old vocal forms. Young musicians are learning the tradition again, studying with the few remaining masters, poring over the hampas and manuscripts, attempting to reconstruct what was nearly lost. But the unbroken chain of master and student that once stretched back for centuries was disrupted, and the music that is played today, however faithful, however beautiful, carries within it an awareness of the gap, the slightly uncertain tenderness of a person recalling the words of a song they have not sung in a very long time. Imagine, one last time, the sound of a single ney, played in an empty mosque courtyard at dusk. The sky above is deepening toward darkness. The stone walls still hold the faintest trace of the day's warmth against your palm, and the sound, that breathy, aching, spiralling line, rises from the courtyard into the evening air, climbing higher and softer, until it is nearly indistinguishable from the silence that surrounds it. And then it stops, and the silence that follows is not empty. It is full of everything the music expressed, and everything it could not express, and everything that exists only in the breath, only in the fleeting, irretrievable moment of its making. And so the sound faded, as all sounds do, into the wide and patient air. That was the voice of the Ottoman world, a world that is gone now, but that left behind, in its fragments and its silences, more questions than answers. And it is with those questions, gently, without insisting on resolution, that we shall bring our long journey at last toward its close. Segment 8. Legacy and Echoes. How the Ottoman Empire still shapes our world. We have come at last to the final chapter of our journey, not into the past this time, but into the present, into the world you and I inhabit right now. The Ottoman Empire ended, formally, on the 1st of November 1922, when the Grand National Assembly of the newly proclaimed Turkish Republic abolished the Sultanate. 16 days later, the last Ottoman sovereign, Mehmed VI, slipped out of Istanbul aboard a British warship, HMS Malaya, bound for Malta. It was a remarkably subdued ending for an empire that had endured for more than 6 centuries. No great battle, no dramatic last stand, just a vote in a parliament, a man on a ship, and the closing of a door that had been open since 1299. But endings, in history, are rarely as clean as they appear. The Ottoman Empire may have ceased to exist as a political entity, but its influence, its fingerprints, its traces, its persistent, unassuming presence in the world that came after did not vanish with it. It is woven into the borders we see on modern maps, into the food we eat, into the words we speak, into the buildings we walk past without noticing, and into the memories. Different, sometimes contradictory, always complicated, that millions of people carry in the countries that were once Ottoman. This is the part of our story where we look for those traces, not with urgency, not with any particular argument to make, just with curiosity, and with the gentle awareness that the past, no matter how distant it may seem, is always closer than we think. Let your eyes rest, and let us begin with borders. If you were to unfold a map of the modern Middle East, smoothing the creases with your palm, tracing the familiar patchwork of nation-states that stretches from Turkey in the north to the Arabian Peninsula in the south, from Egypt in the west to Iraq and beyond in the east, and overlay it with a map of the Ottoman administrative provinces, you would notice something striking. The lines do not match exactly, but in many places, they rhyme. The Ottoman Empire governed its vast Arab territories through a system of vilayets, large provinces, each headed by a governor-general and sanjaks, smaller administrative districts. The Vilayet of Baghdad, the Vilayet of Mosul, the Vilayet of Basra, the Vilayet of Beirut, the Vilayet of Syria centered on Damascus. These divisions were not arbitrary. They reflected, to varying degrees, the geographical, economic, and demographic realities of the regions they encompassed. They determined where taxes were collected, where courts sat, where governors resided, and where the lines of administrative authority ran. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after the First World War, and when the victorious European powers, Britain and France, principally, set about dividing the former Ottoman territories into new states, they did not begin from nothing. They worked, to a significant extent, from the Ottoman map. The three vilayets of Mosul, Baghdad and Basra were combined to form Iraq, a state that brought together Kurdish, Sunni Arab and Shia Arab populations that had previously been administered as separate units. The Vilayet of Beirut and the Mutasarrifate of Mount Lebanon became the basis for modern Lebanon, a state whose confessional political system still carries traces of the Ottoman millet model of governing through recognised religious communities. The Vilayet of Syria became, after much negotiation, the modern state of Syria, and the Sanjak of Jerusalem, which had enjoyed a special administrative status under the Ottomans, became part of the British Mandate for Palestine, the territory from which, in 1948, the State of Israel would emerge. None of this was inevitable, but the Ottoman administrative framework provided the scaffolding, the mental map, the existing roads and telegraph lines in government buildings, the established boundaries that were easier to adopt than to replace upon, which the new political order was constructed, and the tensions that arose between communities that had coexisted within the loose, accommodating framework of Ottoman governance, but that found themselves compressed into nation-states with rigid borders and singular national identities, tensions that persist in various forms to this day. It would be too simple to say that the Ottomans drew the borders of the modern Middle East. They did not. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, the League of Nations mandates, the political bargaining of the interwar years, all of these played their part. But the Ottoman layer is there, beneath the surface, like the foundations of an old building beneath a new one. You may not see it, but it shapes the structure above. The past does not ask permission. It persists in the lines on the map, in the names of the towns, in the inherited shape of the world. And so the borders held, long after the empire that first drew them had ceased to exist. But let us turn now from borders, which are, after all, rather abstract things, lines on paper, concepts argued over in conference rooms, to something far more tangible, something you can taste. The culinary legacy of the Ottoman Empire is one of the most widespread and most enduring in the world. If you have ever eaten baklava, you have eaten something Ottoman. If you have ever eaten burek, or dolma, or kebab, or Turkish delight, or yogurt, which the Ottomans did not invent, but which they did more than any other civilization to popularize across 3 continents, then you have, however unknowingly, participated in a culinary tradition that was developed, refined, and disseminated by the kitchens of the Ottoman court and the street vendors and coffee houses of Ottoman cities. Close your eyes and imagine this, if you will. The flaky, buttery warmth of fresh borek, still warm from a Balkan bakery. A sheet of yufka pastry, rolled so thin that you can see the shadow of your hand through it. Brushed with melted butter, layered with crumbled white cheese. Tangy, slightly salty, yielding then folded, spiraled, and baked until the surface is golden brown and the pastry is separated into dozens of crisp, shattering flakes. You bite into it, and the surface gives way with a soft crack. And then the warm cheese inside yields, and the butter coats your lips, and the salt, and the richness, and the simple, deep warmth of it fill your mouth. It is comfort, distilled, and it is Ottoman. Burek exists in one form or another in the national cuisines of Turkey, Greece, Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, Bulgaria, Lebanon, Egypt, and Tunisia. In each country, it is considered a native dish. In each country, the precise recipe varies, and those variations are defended with a devotion that borders on the sacred. The Greek pteropita is not the same as the Turkish su börek, which is not the same as the Bosnian burek. But the underlying architecture, the paper-thin layered pastry, the filling of cheese or meat or greens is Ottoman in origin, developed in the palace kitchens and carried outward over centuries across every territory the empire touched. The same is true of baklava, which is claimed with equal fervour by Turkey, Greece, Lebanon, Syria and Iran, and which reached its most elaborate and most refined form in the imperial kitchens. It is true of dolma grape leaves or vegetables filled with a mixture of rice, pine nuts, currants and spices, which appears on tables from Athens to Aleppo to Algiers, each version subtly different, each version unmistakably part of the same family. It is true of kebab, which the Ottomans elevated from a straightforward method of grilling meat into a vast culinary category, the shish kebab of central Anatolia, the Iskender kebab of Bursa draped in tomato sauce and yogurt, the doner that has become, in its modern street food form, one of the most consumed dishes on the planet. And it is true of coffee, that drink we spent time with in earlier chapters. The method the West still calls Turkish coffee was refined in the coffee houses of Istanbul and carried outward through trade and diplomacy and imitation to Vienna, to Venice, to Paris, and eventually to the wider world. The Viennese café tradition traces its origins, at least in popular legend, to the coffee beans left behind by the Ottoman forces after the siege of Vienna in 1683. The truth is more tangled than the legend, but the lineage is real, from the coffee houses of 16th-century Istanbul through the coffee houses of 17th-century Europe to the cup you may have held in your hands this morning. The thread has not been broken. Food is the gentlest form of inheritance. It carries no political agenda. It makes no territorial claims. It arrives on the plate warm, fragrant, undeniable, and it connects us, through flavour and technique and tradition, to people who lived centuries before us, whose names we will never know, whose faces we cannot imagine, but whose hands shaped the dough, measured the spices, and tended the fire in ways that we, in our own kitchens, still faithfully reproduce. Imagine yourself there, just for a moment, not in the past, but in the present, in a bakery in Sarajevo, early on a winter morning, where the borek is being pulled from the oven, the air thick with the scent of hot butter and baking, pastry and wood smoke from the old stone oven, or in a cafe in Athens, where a tiny cup of strong, thick coffee is being placed before you on a saucer, the ground still settling, the surface dark and still, or in a kitchen in Beirut, where a grandmother is rolling grape leaves around a filling of rice and herbs, with fingers that move from memory, not from a recipe, and that learned the motion from her own grandmother, who learned it from hers. The chain stretches back, unbroken, into the Ottoman centuries and beyond, and it asks nothing of you but that you eat and taste. The food will remember for you, and life, as it always does, carried its flavours forward, from century to century, from hand to hand, from table to table. Settle deeper now, if you can, and consider this. The Ottoman legacy lives not only on the plate and in the cup. It lives in language, in the words we use without knowing where they came from. The Ottoman Turkish language was, in itself, a remarkable construction, a base of Turkic grammar overlaid with an enormous vocabulary drawn from Arabic and Persian, written in a modified Arabic script, and spoken in a form that varied considerably by class, by region, and by context. When the empire dissolved and its successor states established their own national languages, the Ottoman words did not disappear. They scattered, like seeds carried on a wind, into the vocabularies of every region the empire had governed. In modern Turkish, despite the extensive language reforms of the early republic, which sought to replace Arabic and Persian loanwords with newly coined Turkic equivalents, hundreds of Ottoman-era terms remain in everyday speech. Words like merak, curiosity, hayat, life, dunya, the world, all of Arabic origin, also deeply embedded in the language, that most speakers do not pause to consider their provenance. In Greek, hundreds of Turkish loanwords survive from the centuries of coexistence. Words for foods, for household objects, for customs, for architectural features. In the languages of the Balkans, Serbian, Bosnian, Albanian, Bulgarian, Romanian, the Ottoman linguistic layer is thicker, still, encompassing not only nouns for tangible things, but expressions, idioms and turns of phrase that have been used for so long that their origin has been, in most cases, gently forgotten. The faded curbs of Ottoman calligraphy carved above a forgotten doorway. You might see this, if you know where, to look in any number of cities across the former empire, in the back streets of Sarajevo, in the old quarters of Plovdiv in Bulgaria, above a shuttered shop in the souk of Tripoli in Lebanon, in the stonework of a fountain in East Jerusalem. The script is Ottoman, a flowing cursive form of Arabic letters, designed as much for beauty as for legibility, and the words it spells may be a verse from the Quran, or the name of a benefactor, or a date, or a blessing upon those who pass beneath. Most people walk past without seeing it. The letters are weathered, faded, half obscured by later plaster, or by the grime of decades. But they are there, and they say, to anyone who can still read them, this place was Ottoman once. This stone was carved by an Ottoman hand, and then there are the archives, those vast, silent repositories of written memory that we touched upon in an earlier segment, but that deserve, here at the end, a final word. Picture, if you will, the papery whisper of an archivist, turning the pages of a yellowed firman, a sultanic decree, inscribed on thick cream-coloured paper, its header illuminated in gold and cobalt, its text flowing in the measured Naskh hand of an imperial scribe. The paper is brittle at the edges, the ink has softened from black to a warm sepia brown. The tugra at the top of the Sultan's calligraphic monogram is still perfectly legible, still beautiful, still carrying, across the centuries, the weight of an authority that no longer exists. The digitization of the Ottoman archives, housed principally in Istanbul, but also in Sofia, Sarajevo, Cairo, Damascus, Jerusalem, and dozens of smaller cities, is one of the great scholarly undertakings of our time. Millions of pages are being photographed, catalogued, and in some cases transcribed. Each document is a small aperture into a world that is otherwise silent. A property sale in 17th-century Jerusalem, the petition of a widow in 18th-century Bosnia, requesting the return of her late husband's estate, the accounts of a charitable soup kitchen in 16th-century Cairo, recording in meticulous columns the daily expenditure on lentils, rice, mutton and firewood. These are not grand narratives. They are the paperwork of ordinary life, and they are, in their own way, as moving as any poem, because they tell us that these people existed, that they had property and disputes and marriages and debts and hopes, and that someone once cared enough to write it all down. We take for granted today the ease with which we record and retrieve information. A photograph on a phone, a document saved to a server, a search that returns results in fractions of a second. The Ottomans had none of this. They had scribes and paper and ink and a system of archival storage that was, by the standards of its age, remarkably effective. And the fact that we can still hold those documents today, that the paper has endured, that the ink has held, that the script, though unfamiliar, can still be deciphered, is a testament to the durability of simple materials, the skill of those who made them, and the persistence across centuries of the written word. And so we come, at last, to the question of memory. How is the Ottoman Empire remembered? The answer depends, as it always does, on where you are standing. In Istanbul, there has been, in recent decades, a notable revival of what might be called Ottoman nostalgia. Television dramas set in the imperial court attract vast audiences. Ottoman-themed restaurants serve reconstructed palace cuisine on jewel-toned tablecloths. Ottoman calligraphy and tilework have become fashionable motifs in interior design. Political figures invoke the Ottoman past as a source of pride, a reminder of a time when the Turkish-speaking world stood at the centre of a vast and culturally rich civilization. The nostalgia is selective. Of course it tends to linger on the Golden Age, on Suleiman and Sinan, and the splendours of the 16th century, and to move rather quickly past the more difficult chapters. But it is genuine, and it answers a real need, the need of a modern nation to place itself within a longer narrative, to feel that it is heir to something larger and older than its own founding moment. In Athens, the Ottoman past is remembered differently. For Greece, the centuries of Ottoman governance are often framed as a period of foreign domination, the Topkapı from which the Greek nation freed itself through revolution and sacrifice. And yet, the Ottoman layer is everywhere in Greece, in the food, in the music, in the architecture of towns, where mosques stand converted into museums or sit crumbling beside the churches that replaced them. The relationship is one of entanglement of centuries of shared space, shared meals, shared words, all of which coexist, not always comfortably, with the memory of inequality and the ache of separation. In Sarajevo, the Ottoman past is remembered with a warmth that might surprise those who associate the Balkans only with more recent conflicts. The old Ottoman quarter, the Bashkirtseya, with its narrow lanes, its coppersmith's bazaar, its wooden shop fronts and stone fountains, is the emotional heart of the city. The Bosnian language carries hundreds of Ottoman loanwords. The cuisine, the cevapi, the burek, the strong black coffee served with lokum on a copper tray, is unmistakably Ottoman in its ancestry. The Ottoman centuries are remembered here not as an occupation, but as a formative chapter 1 that gave Bosnia its Muslim community, its distinctive architecture, its coffee culture, and its long tradition of multi-faith coexistence. In Cairo, the Ottoman centuries tend to be overshadowed by Egypt's older and more celebrated histories, the Pharaonic Age, the Fatimids, the Mamluks. But the Ottoman traces are there for those who look in the architecture of certain mosques, in the administrative vocabulary, in the legal traditions, and in the archives that preserve, in meticulous detail, the daily life of Egypt under Ottoman governance. And in Jerusalem, that most layered of all cities, where every stone seems to bear the weight of multiple civilizations. The Ottoman legacy is both everywhere and curiously invisible. The walls of the old city, those iconic walls that define Jerusalem's silhouette in every photograph, were built by Suleiman the Magnificent between 1537 and 1541. The fountains, the inscription stones, the land registry records that still, in certain legal disputes, serve as the basis for property claims, these are Ottoman. The smooth, worn cobblestones beneath your feet in parts of the old city were laid by Ottoman hands 4 or 5 centuries ago, and the narrow streets still follow the routes that Ottoman planners laid down, and the arched doorways still bear, if you look carefully, the faded outlines of inscriptions in stone. Breathe slowly and let this thought settle around you. Perhaps the truest legacy of all is not the grand monuments or the famous recipes or the contested borders, but the unnoticed things. The cool trickle of water from a centuries-old stone fountain in a village square, a fountain that was endowed by some long-forgotten benefactor, built by a local mason, whose name was never recorded, and that still works, still runs, still offers clean water to anyone who passes by, though no one any longer remembers who paid for it or when it was built. The sound of a word used in a kitchen in Thessaloniki, or in a market in Skopje, or in a conversation between friends in Tirana that came, originally, from Ottoman Turkish, and that no one thinks of as foreign, because it has been part of the language for so long that it belongs. That is how empires end, not with a single, definitive conclusion, but with a slow, long dispersal, a scattering of fragments that settle, over time, into the soil of the present, where they become part of the ground we walk on, part of the air we breathe, part of the taste of the food on our plates, and the sound of the words on our tongues. And somewhere, in a Balkan village, in a Jerusalem alleyway, in a courtyard in Cairo, where the afternoon light falls on a stone basin, carved with an inscription that no one can read any longer, a fountain is still running. The water is clear, the stone is warm from the sun, and the sound it makes, that gentle, patient, ceaseless trickle, is the sound of a world that has passed, speaking softly to a world that is still here. The empire is gone, but its traces remain in the borders, in the kitchens, in the languages, in the archives, in the stones. And they will remain for a long time yet, growing fainter with the years, but never quite falling silent, because that is what echoes do. They travel further than the voice that made them, and they arrive, sometimes, in places the speaker never imagined, gently, unexpectedly, like the taste of cardamom in a cup of coffee, or the curve of a calligraphic letter above a door you have walked through 100 times without ever looking up. The story is nearly over now. Breathe gently, let the stillness settle, and know that the echoes go on, closing. And so, gently, we come to the end. We have walked a long way tonight, you and I, 5 hours and 600 years and a great many miles from the timbered houses of 16th-century Istanbul to the stone villages of 19th-century Anatolia, and from there into the corridors of the present day. We began in the half-darkness before dawn, waking to the sound of the Izan drifting over the rooftops of the Fatih district. We bought warm simit from a street baker, the sesame seeds still clinging to our fingers as we walked, and we wandered through the Grand Bazaar, where silk and cinnamon and Venetian glass filled the air with colour and fragrance. We sat in a coffee house and listened to a storyteller's unhurried voice, and we let the warm marble of the hammam ease the weight from our shoulders before the city fell silent for the night. We followed the long, remarkable life of Suleiman, the young prince, who loved calligraphy and poetry, the lawgiver who tried to bring justice to 3 continents, the husband who wrote love letters in verse, and the old man who died in his tent on a distant Hungarian plain, still reaching for one more horizon. We stood beneath the vast dome of Sinan's mosque and felt the hush of a space designed to hold silence. We turned the fragile pages of manuscripts that no one had opened in centuries and traced the journey of an Iznik tile from kiln fire to mosque wall, where it has been catching the light, patiently, for 500 years. We passed through the perfumed courtyards of Topkapı Palace and tasted the saffron and rosewater of imperial banquets, the honeyed layers of baklava, the cool sweetness of sherbet chilled with mountain snow. And then we left the capital behind. We crossed the Aegean in our minds and woke in a stone farmhouse on the Anatolian plateau, where the rhythm of life was set not by sultanic decree, but by the turning of the seasons and the steady clack of a woman's loom. We smelled wood smoke and freshly turned earth. We tasted flatbread pulled warm from the tandir, its surface lightly charred, its centre still soft and steaming. We met Sultan Mahmud II, the prince who survived the cage, who sat in those sealed, stale-aired rooms for years, listening through walls, and who emerged to dissolve the old guard, with patience and resolve, and to carry an ancient empire, fez by fez, and telegraph wire by telegraph wire, into something resembling the modern age. We uncovered half-forgotten mysteries, crypto-Christians whispering prayers behind locked doors, their hymns so soft they barely registered as sound. We watched the Karagos shadow puppets flicker on their screen, saying things that could not be said in any other setting, and we knelt beside an archaeologist brushing dirt from a fragment of clay pipe, and understood that the story of an empire is told not only by its sultan, but by the broken cups and glass bracelets that ordinary people left behind without knowing they were leaving anything at all. And we listened, or tried to listen, to the haunting, breathy sound of a ney flute playing a melody in a mode that most of the world has forgotten, a sound that spirals upward into silence, like smoke from a candle that has just been extinguished. A sound that carries within it, if the Sufis are to be believed, the longing of the soul for something it cannot name. And at last, we followed the empire's traces into the world you and I inhabit today, into the borders, drawn on modern maps, into the baklava and burek on kitchen table, from Athens to Aleppo, and into the stone fountains that still run, softly, in village squares, from the Balkans to Jerusalem. Let yourself rest in this knowledge for a moment. 600 years is a very long time. And the people who lived through those centuries, the bakers who rose before dawn, the weavers who worked until the light failed, the scholars who copied manuscripts by candlelight, the soldiers who marched for months across landscapes far from home, the mothers spinning wool by lamplight while their children slept. They carried worries that we will never fully understand. The uncertainty of harvests, the silence of the cafes, the long miles between one city and the next. The weight of empires on shoulders that were, in the end, only human. Those anxieties are not yours to carry. They have been laid down, century by century, like sediment at the bottom of a very old river. The people who bore them did their bearing. They endured what they endured. They built what they built, and then they rested, as you are resting now. And the world, as it always does, moved on without them. You are here, in this moment, safe and warm. The hammam steam has long since cooled. The bazaar has closed its shutters. The coffee house storyteller has finished his last tale and gone home through the darkened streets. The ney has played its final note, and the silence that follows it is not empty, but full of everything the music said, and everything it could not say, and everything that remains, softly, in the air, after the sound has gone. Closing metta. Centuries separate you from that world, and yet, in some small way, you have been there tonight. You have breathed the dust of the Anatolian road, and the rosewater of the palace courtyard. You have heard the ezan at dawn, and the ney at dusk. You have touched the cold marble of a Sinan mosque, and the warm clay of a village tanda. You have tasted simit and sherbet and flatbread and strong, bitter coffee served in a cup, no larger than an egg. And now it is time to let all of it go slowly. The way you set down a book you have been reading for a very long time, marking the page with a fold, knowing that the story will be there whenever you wish to return. Thank you for spending these hours with me. 5 hours is no small gift of your time, and I do not take it lightly. Whether you have been here from the very first words from the ezan over Fatih and the first light on the golden horn, or whether you drifted off somewhere in the Grand Bazaar, or in the Anatolian village, or in the courtyard garden, where the fountain murmured to itself, and have only just resurfaced now, thank you. It is a privilege to be the voice in your ear as you fall asleep, and I do not forget that. If you enjoyed this journey, I will be here again soon with another. There are always more centuries to wander through, more unhurried lives to uncover, more stories that deserve to be told in a soft voice late at night to someone who is ready to rest. The past is patient. It will wait for us. Now, close your eyes if they're not closed already. Let the weight of the day leave you, all of it, every last ounce. Let your shoulders soften. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands fall open, palms upward, holding nothing, needing nothing. Let your breathing slow to its own natural rhythm. Breathe in slowly, gently, and out. And in again, unhurried and calm, like water finding its way downhill, like the trickle of a stone fountain in a village square, where the jasmine grows against a warm old wall, and the evening air smells of dust and flowers, and the faintest trace of wood smoke from a fire that was lit and tended and allowed to go out a very long time ago, and may the weight of 600 years of history rest as lightly on you as a blanket of fresh snow on an Istanbul rooftop, barely there, soft, and soon to melt into the morning. The story is over, but your rest is just beginning. Good night.